Jordan Bush, welcome back to the podcast. Glad to have you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me, brother.
For those that didn't catch the previous episode, can you give us a little bit of your background again?
Yeah, my name is Jordan Bush. I am a former missionary church planter, pastored a church in Uruguay for 2 years, and now I am the executive director of TGFB Media, which exists to help Christians understand and use Bitcoin for the glory of God and the good of people everywhere. So that's in a nutshell.
Yeah,
that's
awesome.
what we do.
So among other things, you guys write books.
Yep.
Most recent book, The Gospel According to Bitcoin.
Yeah.
A little bit of a controversial name, apparently.
Yeah.
You say in the preface that the book is a thought-provoking exploration of Christianity seen through the metaphor of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah. So basically, I mean, both my co-author and I, so Dan and I are missionaries at heart. And so, when we look around at the world, we just see a world full of opportunities, a world screaming out the glory of God and just opportunities. And we try to leverage these things as opportunities to share the gospel. And so it just so happens that as the two of us have stared at Bitcoin and gotten into it and thought about it for years, there's a whole ton of things within Bitcoin itself that are interestingly and in some cases eerily, they call to mind the scriptures and they call to mind the gospel in all kinds of surprising and non-intuitive ways. So that's kind of what the heart of the book is. Where basically the other book that I helped write was called Thank God for Bitcoin. And the mission with that was basically help Christians, give Christians the elevator pitch for Bitcoin in a way that makes sense to them and that is consistent with things that they care about. And with this book, it was kind of the exact opposite. So we thought that book wasn't niche enough. So let's do something even more niche. So we wrote this book as kind of like the gospel to the people who are in the Bitcoin community, which is represents now hundreds of thousands of people. And many of whom are continuing to become and to get more and more wealthy over time. And there's a very good chance that many of these people will be some of the wealthiest people on earth. And so again, we tried to communicate the message of the gospel using something that they already know and something that they already value and appreciate. And in this case, that meant Bitcoin.
So the gospel seen through the lens of Bitcoin.
Correct.
In that sense. It's not trying to be like a Gnostic gospel.
No.
Or
And this, I just didn't foresee this being as controversial as it was. So I just think like John MacArthur wrote a book called The Gospel According to Jesus, which is, Jesus's take on the gospel, through the gospel accounts. And so again, this is just, again, tongue in cheek, but, there's, Bitcoin is telling a story, the way that it works, all the different things. It's actually telling the story, and remarkably, in all kinds of surprising and non-heretical ways, it does so in a way that we just thought was really interesting and could be helpful with the end that we initially had.
Great. So you and Dan also state in the preface that many people, at least Bitcoiners, have experienced a spiritual revival after discovering Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And that lines up with what Tim and I see.
Yep.
So why do you think that is?
Yeah. And again, if you're not into Bitcoin at all, this sounds like you're probably turning this thing off. You're like, hey, these PCA guys, like they're off the wagon, But no, honestly, I've seen this over and over again. I've seen dozens of people who were either lukewarm Christians or atheists in the hardest extreme, who through getting into Bitcoin just ended up having their hearts softened and became Christians and are now walking with the Lord and serving in local churches and and all kinds of stuff. And again, even though it seems weird at the beginning, it's actually not that crazy when you actually get down into it, because one of the big things about Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is scarce digital money. And so that is in stark contrast to the existing monetary system that every country on earth basically has, which is fiat currency that is effectively limitless. Governments can create limitless amounts of it through the issuance of new debt, which is some of it's actually created physically in the form of bills, but the vast majority, or the overwhelming majority of it, is created digitally. And so again, there's functionally no limit to the amount of money that you can create in that kind of a system. So in that kind of a system, the people who wield the power to create the currency have tremendous power. And I would say in Christian parlance, they have godlike power. And so that's contrasted with throughout human history, nations and governments have used, and people have used different kinds of currencies, but they all had one thing in common, and that's that they were scarce. And so they, whether it's gold or silver or something like that, there's a finite supply that requires a production cost. So if you think about it with gold or silver, if you're going to use gold or silver as money, you have to first locate it, and that takes time. You then have to pay people or get slaves, which has a cost of at least their food. Pay them to dig it up out of the ground. Do all this kind of stuff. You need tools to do that, which requires resources. And then once you get it out of the ground, you have to refine it and do all kinds of stuff with it. So, in a nutshell, there's a production cost that is actually meaningful. There's a meaningful production cost that limits the supply of it. You have to, it's all over the place. It's very deep in the ground, and so. That's one element to this. Now, again, contrasting that with fiat currency, if you're talking about paper currency, then you're talking about, you can take a piece of paper, which is really plentiful, and you can basically cut it into small pieces of paper, and you can, on one piece of paper, write a 1, and another identical piece of paper, write 100, and now, for some reason that has nothing to do with the production cost, one of these bills is now worth 100 times the other one. And so what this actually does is, if you have godless central banks or godless rulers, godless governing authorities, and they want to use this, they have tended to use fiat currency, endless currency, to subsidize and pay for any crazy idea that they have. So historically, things like war, which are very costly, first of all, they have been, one of the things that's cut them short is that one of the sides or both sides run out of money. And so scarce currency has actually contributed to wars being not as long as they would otherwise be. And so we've observed this. Now, we look at this in the last 100 years, the bloodiest century in human history, more people killed in wars than any other century in history. And this has been the century of central banking. Every country on earth has a central bank that operates for the vast majority of this century under fiat constraints, which is no constraints. And so it should not also then surprise us that if this is the case, okay, historically speaking, and that in this century, under the reign of fiat currency all over the world, that you would also see the peak atheism, okay, in terms of the largest number of people or percentage in human history. It shouldn't surprise us at all, because every government on earth is able to create as much money as they want to and use it to fund anything they want to in pursuit of their own legislative agenda or something like that. And so now why does that matter? Because money at bottom is will fulfillment technology. Okay, the Lord tells us, Jesus, his disciples asked him to pray, and in answering them, he said, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. May your kingdom come. May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Okay, so that's the telos that God wants us to pursue as humans in his world. The problem is that endless fiat currency that basically doesn't force governments to be accountable to anyone, functionally anyone. It allows them to say, "Let my kingdom come and let my will be done on earth." It's not in heaven, but on earth. And so you have things like what are examples of this? Well, the only reason that the United States, in our particular context, is able to send hundreds of millions of dollars to Africa to help them murder their children is because they have endless money. They can just kick the can down the road, print new debt, and then they'll just say, hey, our kids and grandkids will pay it off. The only reason why the United States government can, through public schools, fund hundreds of millions of dollars, the LGBT agenda, trans education, all these kind of things, these are not market desired things. These are not things where the people are crying out, we want these things. The government is largely subsidizing all of these insane messages that there is no demand for, and giving the false idea that there actually is demand for these things. And so again, this is why these things matter. So Bitcoin, as crazy as it sounds, and as novel and ephemeral as it sounds on some level, is actually far closer in in nature and how it is created and all these kind of things to gold and silver and shells and all these other scarce things than something like fiat currency, because there is a finite amount of them and you can't violate that limit. So that'd be one long drawn out explanation.
No, I think that was great. There was a couple things you said in there. One, with the Lord's Prayer on earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah.
I think this is where a lot of my mill and post-mill compatriots, especially in the PCA, get excited, because in a sense, it feels like Bitcoin lines up with that kind of eschatology.
Yep.
You say in the first meditation, or you guys say,
Yep.
The world needs Bitcoiners who will help to usher in a better world for our children and our children's children. So the idea of sort of generational wealth. Can you elaborate on that a bit and kind of talk about, I mean, I agree, needs Bitcoiners, but just any Bitcoiners, like...
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, so it's one of these things where, I mean, what would be an example of this? There's people who are not Christians who make tremendous additions to the world. Like they create things that end up being humongous, whether the internet or, whatever you want to, the cotton gin, you go back. Like there's obviously people who are, you don't have to be a Christian to do things that are tremendously helpful to society. But again, what you believe about ultimate reality touches everything else. It influences everything else. And so if you embrace as part of your initial commitments, if you embrace a money that is fundamentally at odds with the way that God designed the world to function, then everything else that money, as one example, touches is going to be affected by that poisoned root or whatever. So in terms of children, I mean, this is so in the scriptures. It says in the Proverbs, it says that a godly man or a righteous man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. Okay. Now, again, we have a whole segment of Christendom who is quick to point out, well, that's not just a monetary inheritance. And it's like, okay, great. I agree with that 100%. Okay. But it's not less than a monetary inheritance. Okay. And obviously we could go to the far extremes where there are obviously people who do not have enough money. They're so poor that they will not likely leave a monetary inheritance to their children. Okay. But as Christians, we don't argue from the exceptions to the rule. That's not how this works. Okay. That's how the world works. And the world is full of people using this kind of argumentation, arguing from the exceptions to argue that there is no rule or, whatever. What if we look around at the world right now, and again, we can look throughout history. This is not some sort of novel situation we're finding ourselves in. We can look at throughout time and where the countries, the civilizations, the empires, that one of the things that allows them to rise and reach a point of extreme power and influence over the world, they are all categorically built upon having the strongest currency in the world, okay? Every single one of them. And then also, interestingly, every single one of them, as they start to wane, okay, one of the reasons why they wane is because they start to devalue their currency. They start to, in the case of if you've got gold or silver, if you've got precious metal coins, one of the things that they would do, and Gary North is somebody who's written extensively on this, they'll add in baser metals into the monetary supply. So you take, let's say you've got 100% gold coins or 99% gold coins, and you're telling your people these coins are 99% gold. Well, but then the governing authority says, you know what, I would love to do that over there, but we don't have any money to do that. So then he goes to his coin makers and he says, hey, let's make it only 98%. We'll do 98% gold. Nobody will be able to tell. If you're looking at it, you won't be able to tell. If you're holding it, if you drop it, it'll sound pretty much identical. And so what this happens, so this is a way for governments fundamentally, in Gary North's words, he says this is a violation of the 8th commandment. Thou shalt not steal. This is governing authorities trying to expand their purchasing power. And the consequences is that their people suffer, because fundamentally their people are not privy to the reality of what's going on, and the governing authorities are benefiting at the expense of their people. So this is something that we see over and over again. And so again, this is doomed to fail. This is always fails every single time. We could go into a long thing about this, but in the scriptures, one of the dominant principles that we see over and over again is the principle of sowing and reaping. And so this is, God says, the Apostle Paul at the end of the book of Galatians says that God is not mocked, for what a man sows, that will he also reap. And so Paul is saying that God is so hardwired in all kinds of places, this principle of sowing and reaping, that to deny it, the only way you can deny this is in denying this, you mock God. It's so obvious that this is the case. And so with one of the places where you can see this fleshed out is in the currency. So in every single case, the government officials aren't content with 98% gold coins. They then move to 97, 96, and before you know it, they get down to losing all of the value of these precious metals, and they're completely debased. And so, again, the consequences of this, you might think, well, what does that really matter? And the reality is that scarcity is a really important part of value. It's certainly not the only element of value, but it is a very crucially important one. And so once you get far away from scarcity and you get far away from things being what they said they're supposed to be, it introduces all kinds of confusion and deceit and frustration at a variety of levels.
We'll come back to the scarcity one in a bit. For those that haven't read the book, I just wanted to point out it's laid out in 21 meditations, one per chapter. So I was going to go through each meditation. You talk about scarcity later. But to go in the order of the book, in meditation 2, you quote James Smith. He says, "Behind every pedagogy is a philosophical anthropology." Okay. What does that mean?
We're with the PSA guys, right? They're PCA guys. So this is, the big brains are out, right? You guys know exactly what this means.
They know what it means. I'm kind of the dunce in the group.
Now what this is not is a blanket approval of everything James K. Smith has ever said or is saying even today. I just saw something, or will say in the future. Not at all. But James has some good things to say. And so this book, in his book, Desiring the Kingdom, this quote from his book, Desiring the Kingdom, talks about the fact that so a pedagogy is a way of teaching, okay? So every pedagogy is rooted in what is this here?
The philosophical anthropology.
Yes, in a philosophical anthropology. So every pedagogy, every way of teaching is rooted in a philosophical understanding anthropology, understanding what it means to be human. Okay, so when you, in this particular case, when you structure your educational systems, okay, you first have to take into account, well, what is a person? Okay.
Apparently, that's a really hard problem for people to define lately, especially when it comes to genders.
Correct. Yeah. And so again, then all of that is rooted in a lot of the stuff that we're going to get into. So we're in a point of definitional crisis, where because we've rejected the idea that there is a God who is reigning over us, who we are accountable to, and in favor of allowing ourselves to be gods, we have also forsaken knowledge, like authoritative knowledge of just about everything. Okay, we don't know what it means to be a man. We don't know what it means to be a woman. We don't know what it means to be what marriage is. We don't know what a church is. We don't know what government is. There's all kinds of confusion and argumentation about each one of these things. And because again, you can give your opinion, but if truth is all relative, then your opinion is just that. Why should I care about your opinion if there's no correspondence between reality and your opinion?
That goes. I wouldn't say that as moderns we have a unique claim on being idiotic like that.
No.
I mean, Pilate's asking
what is truth?
Correct. Truth, right? So
yes,
it's
100%.
It goes all the way even before Pilate.
And these things are cyclical too. That's a big part of this.
Yeah.
And so there are a ton of similarities between what was going on in Jesus' day and what's going on right now. So,
and of course the Romans ended up debasing their currency as well.
Correct.
But so then later, so we're still in meditation 2.
Yes.
Later you say fiat currency operates on a Darwinian animalistic anthropology, whereas Bitcoin embodies a moral, dignified, and elevated view of humanity.
Yeah.
So can you give us a little more color on that sort of comparison there?
Correct. Okay, so I'll back up a little bit because we did the pedagogy thing, so that's teaching. What the claim that we make in this meditation is that the same thing is true about money. Okay, so what you believe about money, okay, and what is rooted in what you believe about people. And so the way that you can see this is And this requires a little bit of monetary history. So in 1913, the Federal Reserve was created in the United States. And so the way that this happened is that there was a small group of bankers and politicians. Okay. Now, what did the bankers and politicians want? The bankers, there was something going on called the wildcat banking era, where as the country is growing, there were and more people who realized, wait, we can make lots of money in banking. And so the existing banking entities didn't like the competition. And so one of the things that you do when you don't want competition is you collude with government. We see this all over the place today. And so one of the things that they did, there were some of the, like JP Morgan, I believe was one of them. A lot of these guys, they went to some politicians and said, hey, we should create a central bank, okay, which is actually a private institution. It's not a federal institution. It is a private institution that makes profits and all kinds of stuff. We should create a central bank. And then we should also we should put an artificial peg on the currency. So rather than the free market determining what the value of gold and silver was, which is constitutionally in the United States the only things allowed to settle debts, they basically said we're going to put, and this is a little bit later, but we're going to basically set the system up where we are the gods of the system fundamentally, and then over time, what that divine power looked like changed. It eventually moved away from gold and silver altogether in 1971, but really, the seeds of this was sown in 1913 because there was a change in the god of the system. And so what you saw is that this small group of politicians and central bankers decided, you know what, we're going to make a change in the money, not in the best interest of everybody else, but we want to benefit. Again, the stated thing is we want to benefit everyone, but they definitely wanted to benefit themselves by removing competition. So what you have now is you had a monetary system that is oriented around this small group of people rather than oriented around the good of the populace, which in Christian, why should we care about that? In Christian terms, that would be loving our neighbors. Okay, and then again, what does this have to do? It also has to do with loving God. Okay, what does this have to do with loving God? Well, one of the ways that we love God is by submitting ourselves to the world that He made and the rules that He designed, the parameters that He designed to govern it. And so, effectively, like we said, these government officials and central bankers were basically saying, "Hey, we don't like that kind of a world. We're not in full control in that world, and so we want to create a different world, and we want to denominate life in that world in a currency that more suits us." And so this is a big problem. Now, again, we kind of talked about that a little bit, but again, we can contrast that with something like gold, where gold, again, as we mentioned, is scarce. It requires yes or no decisions, binary decisions. You can either have this or this. You can't have both. And so again, this goes back to the principle of sowing and reaping. Sowing and reaping, if you do this will be the consequence. God, like logic is divine. Okay, one of the differences between people and animals is that God says to sinful Israel, He doesn't say, "I'm just going to beat you," and until you do what I want. He says, "Come, let us reason together." And so this is all of these things are tied together. And so we go from a system that where the currencies were chosen by the people, based on the characteristics that these monetary, whether they were shells or precious metals or whatever, they had characteristics that actually the people found valuable, which is a whole other conversation. But again, so when you change the money at the root of the system, okay, you're fundamentally doing that. You're fundamentally changing the way and like the anthropology of the system. Because before you had a system where everybody was created equally. Everyone had to abide by the same rules. If you're going to create more money, there's a production cost. With the Federal Reserve System, you've now said, no, there are gods, effectively. There are a small group of people who control the monetary supply. And then there's people, normal people, who effectively are peons in the system. They don't have any control over this. And the people at the top benefit at the expense of the small people. So that's the Cliff Notes version of that.
All right, let's move on to the third meditation.
Yep.
In the third meditation, you call fiat currency a monetary Tower of Babel.
Yep.
What does that mean?
Yeah. So again, I don't need to explain the Tower of Babel to you fine folks. But yeah, you've got this system in the Tower of Babel where the people realize God tells them to go out into the earth, to be fruitful, multiply, fill it. We see this, and they basically realize, well, if we do that, well, then our lives are going to be more difficult. It's not a coincidence that right after that we see God call out Abraham. Right. And so, again, it's easy for us who live in a modern day and who are accustomed to traveling very easily and who have all kinds of resources. We got the internet. We got all kinds of things. It's easy for us to just take for granted what a big deal it was to kind of spread out and go away from your family. You're in a point where these people that was your lifeblood. You had your family, you'd stay close to them. You guys would all work together and you'd all benefit. So when God is telling them to do this, He's actually telling them to do something pretty radical. He's again, on one level, he's asking them to trust him. He's saying, trust me, and because you trust me, obey me. And the vast majority of these people, as humans have done since Genesis 3, they said, we don't want to trust you. We want security that we can see. And so we want glory for ourselves. We don't want glory for God. We want glory for ourselves. And so what they do is they say, hey, we're going to build a tower. Okay, we're going to build a tower for ourselves all the way up to heaven. We're going to get glory for ourselves. This thing is going to be the biggest building ever. We're going to build it up all the way to the heavens. So this is this divine challenge of God's authority. And so obviously we see, so this is what they did. This was what was motivating their actions. And there's a very real sense in which fiat currency is motivated and operates according to this exact same desire and to this exact same end. Functionally, because if money is limitless, then there's nothing that you won't be able to do, in a very real sense. And so this is part of the problem. And you see this. We've seen endless wars. We've seen longer wars. We've seen more intense wars. We've seen, all kinds of things. And much of it is only possible because you have functionally endless money and a will to continue to print it or create more of it. And so again, there's a lot of parallels that we could get into, but that's
I was kind of thinking about the flip side of it where I think I've heard Robert Breedlove say a lot of times that money is like a language to communicate value.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
So I'm thinking about their language being confused after the Tower of Babel.
Correct. Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
So
you want to?
So it's a really interesting thing because yes, the point of language is to enable efficient communication and efficient participation between people. And so again, by staying in one place, everyone had one language, and so they were able to achieve something that none of them would have been able to do on their own. It would have been impossible for one person, to build a tower up, up to heaven. Although, divinely enabled Noah did pretty good, made a humongous boat, but it wouldn't have been possible on their own. And so, you have these guys who just basically, God's way to break up this godless, glory project, vain glory project of humanity is basically to divide their language. He basically provides, if you want to think about money as a language, he basically divides it up into multiple currencies. So he does this because, again, God has a goal. God has a purpose. He has a telos towards which he's working, the world is working, and for which he created people to be moving to. And so, again, all of this, it comes down to will fulfillment technology. God has a will that he's trying to carry out in the world. And the problem is that sinful people also have a will. And those two things this is the war of the ages. This is the whole thing. And so, the Tower of Babel is one place where you see this, fleshed out.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite stories in the Bible, so I'm going to linger on this
one
just a little bit. I agree with you. It's like between different fiat currencies, there's sort of an inability to communicate because there's these floating exchange rates and people are debasing. I mean, this is even with the latest stuff going on with the tariffs and everything. There's, world leaders saying, well, you're debasing your currency more to give yourself an advantage in this case. Yeah. And it's confusing our trade between us and but then even just within a currency itself, like if you and I are trading in dollars, we're confused about how many dollars I should even give you for the thing that you're producing, right?
Yes.
And so it confuses our language. So the alternate take here is that Bitcoin could be seen as like a Tower of Babel on the front end because it now brings us all together with one purpose and allows us to communicate.
One currency.
Right. Yeah. So like with any technology though, it's not it doesn't have like a morality on its own. That's how we use it, right?
Yep.
So it's like going back to the previous meditation with the children's children and stuff like that.
Yep.
It's, we can use Bitcoin to do something great multi-generationally.
Yep.
Or it could be potentially used to
And so again, there's a lot of people, we might get into this later, but there's a lot of people who, when they think about Bitcoin, one of the things, especially in the Christian world, that comes up among a certain segment of Christendom is, the mark of the beast or something like this. And they're like, oh, this is a one world currency. And it's like, okay, all right, I just want you guys to know that gold in the past has occupied a level of usage and like a saturation and usage among the people of the world that is far greater than Bitcoin is likely to achieve for a long time. So like if that is something that bothers you, just know that gold existed in that position far before something like Bitcoin existed. So
okay, this leads pretty good into the next. So we're on meditation 4 now.
Okay.
You got a great quote from C.S. Lewis. I'm going to read the whole thing just for the sake of our listeners. It's from The Way to Glory. He says, "There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors." Okay, so I think Bitcoin fits into the first category, right? Obviously, it's not immortal. But strangely, it seems to cast a shadow that is closer to the second category, the immortal. Do you think this is part of the appeal of Bitcoin and possibly why people even start to worship it or make it kind of a religion or even call it God?
Yeah, I do. And I think one of the reasons it does that is because, again, there's one of Jesus' most famous quotes is that those who are well have no need of a physician. Okay, so you don't really appreciate a physician until you're sick. You don't look for one until you're sick. And so one of the things we have tons of people who have experienced the negative consequences. Now, again, if you're in America and you're hearing this, like things have been not ideal the last few years, but up into this, you've been, hey, what's the big deal? Things have been great. But every other currency on earth that doesn't have, ready access to the world reserve currency, okay, their nation doesn't hold that, they have a much more difficult time. And their currencies fail repeatedly, on average every 13, 14 years. And so for them, they're experiencing the dishonoring of their time, their labor, all these things. So again, you can imagine it like this. Again, to the previous point about your every currency is rooted in a philosophical anthropology. Like there are currencies and monies that do a better job of honoring people as image bearers of God, and for us as Christians, there's currencies that do a better job of honoring people's time, labor, energy, etc. And there's currencies that do a worse job of that. And so in the case of fiat currency, it does an awful job of doing this because it allows governments and central banks to create massive amounts of currency basically immediately and steal purchasing power away from normal people. We saw this in I don't know if we're allowed to use the word, in the Corona something, whatever. We saw this happen where in the span of a few months, 80% of all the dollars that have ever existed were created. And so what was the consequences of that? Well, we look at the housing market. The housing market exploded. People's homes, if not actually doubling, got close, and sometimes it was worse than that. Did the houses get better during that crisis? No. All that happened is there was way more currency units competing for more or less the same number of houses. And so basically, if you didn't have a house, the barrier to you getting one in the future became, including myself, got even more harder or even harder to the point that it's, potentially could be impossible. And so, this is one of these things where, Bitcoin, as crazy as it sounds, Bitcoin, again, operates a lot more like gold and silver. It allows normal people to hold a currency unit that whose supply is finite and whose issuance is not controlled by any government or any official or a central bank or anything like that. And so, again, because that's the case, it inherently honors, in a very real sense, people to a better degree.
All right. I had originally slated asking this question about Meditation 5. I know Dan wrote that one. I think you can actually talk to the second part of it, though. So Dan admits he was afraid that earthly forces could somehow overshadow God's sovereignty.
Yeah.
Bitcoin reminded him that God is at work behind the scenes. So
yeah.
Are you kind of agreeing with Dan saying Bitcoin's part of God's plan, sort of at work, bringing more equity and justice to the world?
Yeah.
But I can't guess what your answer is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, you can. But yeah, I think, so again, this is going to make Christians really weird, okay? Or really, really uncomfortable, especially theological guys. You're getting really uncomfortable, okay? So when I would say yes, but I'd want to frame it in very carefully, okay? Because I love Jesus and I want to be very careful too. So when I think about Bitcoin in a very similar way as I think about the printing press, okay? So what kind of effect, was the printing press a gift from God?
Arguably, yes.
Yeah. And
look at all the Bibles that we have now.
Correct. And like, look at the way, I mean, the Protestant Revolution or Reformation, there's a lot of people who would call it a revolution. Yeah. But the Protestant Reformation would not have been possible to the same degree. It was aided significantly, tremendously by the printing press. And so, in the same way, Bitcoin, and what did the printing press do? It decentralized and allowed people who were not one of these select few at the top of these, systems of power to basically communicate and to, communicate whether it was dissent or whether it was, theological dissent or, whatever it happened to be. This is something that, it was something that God used in meaningful ways. And again, the reason why I understand the hesitance to attribute something directly to being from God. And I understand, I agree with that to a point. At the same time, I also have the book of James. I have the brother of our Lord in my ear, and I hear him saying that every good and perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no shadow of turning. And so the alternative is giving God credit for it is to try to take credit for it ourselves. Okay. Now, again, there's a whole bunch of people who may be listening to this or watching this who may be thinking, well, Bitcoin's not even that big of a deal. Like, how good and perfect gift? That sounds nuts. And again, I get it, to you as an American, that might sound insane. And that's because of the context that you're in. There are many people around the world for whom Bitcoin, including some of the most impoverished people on earth, for whom Bitcoin is this radical lifeboat that, again, is not doing anything on an eternal plane to save their soul or whatever, but it's giving them access to a currency that is far less volatile than their local currency, which in some cases, again, I was a pastor of a church in Uruguay. Half our members were Venezuelan immigrants. At various points during our time in Uruguay, they would hear from family that their day-to-day inflation rate was 100%. So they would go to the grocery store in the morning and eggs would be $5. And then they'd go to work and they'd get off work and they'd go to the grocery store and they'd be $10. And so a lot of Americans look at Bitcoin, they're like, oh, look how volatile it is. And it's like, volatility is a relative phenomenon. And so for many other people, Bitcoin is increasingly being looked to as a far better option, even on that limited plane, than their existing options.
Meditation 6.
Yeah.
You guys get into karma versus biblical justice.
Yeah.
So you say Bitcoin honors natural law. In your mind, does that mean it operates closer to the idea of biblical justice as opposed to karma?
Yeah. So again, the scriptures, specifically the Proverbs, they talk a lot about just weights and measures. Okay. And the reason for this is, in currency is one unit of measure. It's one way to measure the value of different things. And so again, and this was a temptation that went back there as well. There was dilution of silver, and your wine has become, I can't remember what it is, not dross, but you have these kind of things where these same principles are talked about. And so having again, God is not a respecter of persons. God doesn't favor the rich over the poor, or the powerful against the weak. He doesn't do this. He treats people the same. And so currencies are one way for people to honor and submit themselves to this principle that God has laid out as being vitally important to him, including to the degree that God calls an unjust weight measure an abomination in Proverbs. Okay. Now, again, there's lots of things that Americans and that heady Christians rightfully think about that leap to mind when we think about abomination. Okay. Those are all right and good. Until 6 years ago, I had never remotely heard of, thought, believed that something like an unjust weight measures in general, or specifically as it applies to money, could ever be something that God could care that much about, that it would be called an abomination. So yeah, I think this is obviously something that is really important. Now, again, separating, so this gets at the difference between karma and the biblical idea of justice, right? So now, what is the difference between karma and justice? Okay, the big difference is that there's a personal God. Okay, justice or karma is basically there is a cold, dead universe. There's laws that are out there. They're just operating like this. There's no mercy. There's none of these things. This is the earth is operating, effectively, it's super impersonal. There's nothing you can do about it. It's merciless, the whole deal. Now that's contrasted, okay, with the biblical paradigm for this, which is the world is governed by the God who made it. Okay, every single person is governed by the God in whose image they're made. And so now again, this is not a new phenomenon. This is not even just, again, we use the word karma. So people are thinking initially Eastern religions. Okay, this is absolutely a biblical phenomenon as well. There's some friends of myself and our family. We're doing a Bible study right now through the book of Romans. And one of the things that blew my mind is that this exact issue is part of what Paul is critiquing with the people of Israel. They fundamentally are looking at the law as if this is something that we can keep. God intends us to keep it. The law is where we find our salvation. If we just keep this thing well enough, then we'll be accepted by God. If we don't keep it, then we'll be rejected. But again, even beyond that, we are the people of God. And so it's this, they're treating the world and the system that God made in this impersonal, cold, distant manner where, again, intention doesn't matter, all of these kind of things. This is completely at odds with the gospel of Jesus Christ, where Paul basically goes in and says, no, look, God had people before Israel. Like Abraham was saved while he was a Gentile. Abraham was saved without the law. And so this is something humans are always tempted. Okay, we're always tempted and drawn away from a situation or a way of living that requires intimate trust of a personal God. And we move in favor of an impersonal system list of laws that is much more comfortable for us. It works with it's much more comfortable. It makes us feel a lot better, that kind of a system. And so the same thing is true here. So fiat currency basically is this system where, again, it's cold, it's dead. It basically treats people as economic units rather than image bearers of God. It's very cold, clinical, and it's at odds with the way that God designed the world to function. That's contrasted with, again, scarce currencies, like including Bitcoin, that, again, there's only two ways to get more Bitcoin. We don't have to go into a whole thing. There's only two ways to get more Bitcoin. One is to take real-world electricity and use it to plug a computer into it that's designed to only do that, and then mine Bitcoin. Okay, so it requires scarce resources, scarce energy, all these kind of things. Or you can buy Bitcoin from somebody who's already done that process. So there's fixed inputs and outputs. And it's very personal. It actually operates within the constraints of the world that God made. And so these two things, they could not be more different. And again, those things have consequences, especially over time. Again, when God created the world and we talk about sowing and reaping, it's not just one-to-one sowing to reaping. It's sowing and exponential reaping. So God created the world where he gives you, there's an apple tree. You take down the apple, you eat it. It has seeds inside. You throw them in the ground. You don't just grow one more apple. You get a tree that produces hundreds of or thousands of apples over the course of its life. And so it's this sowing and exponential reaping, all governed by a personal God.
I feel like for the outsider looking in, or the non-technical person, or the uninitiated, a lot of people tend to make a distinction between fiat currencies or kind of real world currencies and cryptocurrencies.
Yep.
But I think it's interesting here. Maybe the better distinction is currencies that honor natural law and currencies that don't.
100%.
And even within cryptocurrencies, the second biggest cryptocurrency, at least right now, is Ethereum.
Yep.
Vitalik has been famously quoted for being very annoyed at the limitations of the proof of work consensus mechanism.
Yeah.
And they switched over to proof of stake, which allowed them to essentially start dishonoring natural law.
Yeah.
And ever since then, the price of Ethereum relative to Bitcoin has just been going down.
Yeah.
So it's like people intuitively understand that they don't want to put their energy or store their energy in something that is controlled by sort of gods of the system.
That another man can create for free.
Yeah, exactly. Whether it's Federal Reserve chairman or metallic butyrin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's one of these things where, again, I would argue you could even say the difference between the two systems is one is a system with God at the top. The other one is a system with a rival, small g, God, at the top. And this is whether on a spiritual plane, on a physical plane, all these things, like that is the question. That is the question that humanity always comes down to. And again, there's always people, God has his, remnant of people who, submit to his submit to and embrace his governance and his rulership over the world. And then there's other people, the vast majority of them, will just kind of buck against that and try to, it's the difference between being a steward and being a God. Okay, God created us to be stewards, and we're always tempted to try to throw off and take on more responsibility for ourselves.
All right, I'm staying in meditation 6.
Okay.
Let's zero in on that grace bit.
Okay.
So you go on to say, the law of grace, and this is coming, the law of grace is a deeper magic, which is a reference to Aslan's sacrifice in Lion, Witch, and Warbird, and that it is more powerful than natural law. Can you explain that? And then, how does Bitcoin help lead people to understanding grace from a biblical concept?
So this is one of these things which sounds probably insane to a lot of these people. There are probably C.S. Lewis appreciators out there.
Yeah.
And you're like, how are you, lots of appreciation. Probably, why are you besmirching my beloved C.S., with this, besmirching with Bitcoin? But this is, again, it's a very similar principle of, again, God made the world to function a certain way. Okay. He is the king of the world. Okay, and we can either submit ourselves to that reality, or we can deny that reality. And so again, natural law, God made the world to function a certain way. And now again, why do people buck against it, or why do especially governing officials? Because it's something that says no. Okay, it's something that looks at something they want to do and says you may not. And humans don't like this. We don't like our parades being rained on. And so in a very real way, like Bitcoin is this thing, even though it's shiny and digital and weird, I would just encourage people to not make the same mistake God has been using foolish things to shame the wise for thousands of years, okay? Depending on your how old you think the world is, the world, God's been doing it for a long time. And again, we could get into why, but Bitcoin is just one of these things where it's the type of thing that he would do. Things look very bleak. The currencies of the world are all collapsing because the governments have abused them. People are, in tumult, all these kind of things. And then along comes this little magic internet money. And basically people are looking to it and basically trying to opt out of a system that preys upon them, opt out of a system that is at odds with reality, at odds with, every other principle that governs every part of life. And they're realizing, wait, this, on the surface, this looks nuts. But when I actually look into this and look at how it operates and all these things, it actually isn't nuts. It actually makes sense. And it's actually far more ancient and real than I could have ever imagined. And so that's been kind of our experience. Now, to the grace point, again, the reality is that grace is, it's not something that you deserve. It's not something that, we all deserve this. And, we get down to this thing where we're all struggling, especially people over the world are real struggling. And then, we had this giant big project where all of the most powerful, smartest entities of the world got together. No, it's like a bunch of nerds. It's like 10 nerds on an open internet forum. Anybody could talk to this thing. Anybody could participate. Anybody, if they wanted to, who has internet can participate in this thing. And they just start doing it. It's in the dark corners of the internet. It seems foolish. People just aren't, everybody's ignoring it. All the biggest people on earth are ignoring it. And that's that's how God does what he does. He does it in these weird little ways that are foolish to men, but that actually have far more, that are powerful and that affect big change. And so we're, at this point, 16 years in, Bitcoin is being held as is being held by the largest and most powerful nation on earth as a store of value, as a reserve. We have a strategic Bitcoin reserve that people are realistically anticipating could be a humongous part of global geopolitics and a whole bunch of other things in the very near future. So it's a whole wild story.
It does seem like the way that Bitcoin was created and launched is done in a way that is foolish to men.
Yeah.
Kind of it begs the question: was Satoshi actually a man?
Yeah.
I've kind of theorized, it's like Gabriel doing a commit to GitHub, but we don't have to go into that.
I will say too, in terms of the grace thing. Again, and this is why everything is a gift from God, and that includes ideas. So this idea, the idea for Bitcoin wasn't like a one-off. It was building on 40, 50 years of cryptography and philosophy and technical challenges, and all of these things come together in this radical thing of Bitcoin. And so again, all of these things, this is how God works. He gives little ideas, and then over time they grow slowly, and then they end up being big, powerful things that, again, no individual person gets ultimate glory for.
It's just amazing to see Satoshi walk away from.
Yeah. Now, again, we can talk about that. I'm not convinced he walked away. I'm more convinced like he died.
Yeah,
or
Hal Finney style.
Exactly.
Well, we don't have to speculate on that. Let's go to meditation 7. This one's a fun one.
Yep.
So the illustrious Jimmy Song made a controversial claim in Bitcoin 2021 in Miami. He said, "We're all culpable for inflation because we all take out loans on things like houses and cars, which increases the money supply." That's true. You point out that this is the common man's way to use the Cantillon effect in his favor. So first of all, for our listeners, what is the Cantillon effect? And then, is there a moral imperative here for Christians to live debt-free? Like, do we have to be eternal renters? Mm-hmm. What is that? What's he saying? Do you agree with him?
Yeah. So the Cantillon effect is this economic principle.
You're saying it with this
Cantillon. Yeah.
Cantillon.
Yeah. Well, it's because isn't he French? Is Cantillon? I think. Yeah. So Cantillon. But so basically, it's this principle that those who are closest to the point of monetary creation, when they get the money, they basically have an advantage over every other economic actor in the system. So again, if the prices are. Yeah, basically prices of housing, for example, are based on supply and demand, okay? And so if I go out and I get a loan, which requires more knowledge of how the sausage gets made, it used to be that banks would loan out a percentage of their deposits, okay? And so there actually was a fixed amount of currency in the system. That is by no means how things work today. Every single loan that is given out in the normal banking system is basically, it's creating new currency units. It's issuing new debt. Okay, that will then.
So banks are allowed to, when they create a loan, they're allowed to issue against reserves they don't have, fractional reserve.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
So effectively, issuing a loan is creating new dollars.
Yes.
Okay.
And it was for a while. So again, this kind of whittled down over time. It used to be full reserve banking, and then you get down to fractional reserve banking, and it was mostly reserve. And then you get down for the 90s and early 2000s, you had like a 10% reserve. Okay, so banks only needed to have on hand, 10% of what they actually, said they did, and they could lend out to that effect. But once COVID happened, okay, all reserve requirements were removed in early 2020.
Well, not only that, but when they issue the loan and then that money gets deposited in another bank, it counts as reserves.
Correct. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So, and then they get to issue more.
So it's this whole perverse system. So that's what the Cantillon effect does, and it disproportionately, it basically allows new debt issuance to steal purchasing power, to have this asymmetrical information that nobody else in the market has.
So Jimmy's correct. Yeah. In a sense, if you take a loan out, you're participating in money creation, which is not great.
Yes.
And then if you use that money to go bid on a house, theoretically that house's price hasn't gone up yet
Yeah.
because you're using new dollars that the market isn't aware of.
Yes.
So then it's causing more inflation to happen. So
Correct.
That's all true. So is there a moral imperative here for Christians to be Dave Ramsey style, debt-free?
Okay. Now this is it depends how seriously you take your Bible, Jim. This is, because so now here's I'm going to agree with Jimmy, which sounds extreme. Okay. So yes, we are contributing to the problem. We are part of the problem. It's easy to point at, again, the United States government in 2020 and be like, look what they did. It's like, yeah, that was bad. Okay. They shouldn't have done that. At the same time, we're participating in a system where we are going along with this large. There are people who don't, okay? But a lot of us are going along with this system. Now the question is, what do you do about this? Now, I'll actually raise the stakes, okay? The scriptures are replete, okay, in the Old Testament, talking about the danger of debt. Okay. Now, again, danger doesn't mean you never do it. Okay. It just means you need to know that what you're doing is seriously dangerous. So Proverbs, replete, tons of examples. And then you get into the New Testament. Okay. You get into the New Testament and you see the Apostle Paul saying things like, owe no man anything except to love one another. Now, I know a lot of us humans, we like to squirm out. All right. That seems pretty exact. This seems pretty ironclad, bulletproof. How do we get... Owe no man anything except to love one another. Okay. So now, the first thing I would say is, in the same way. Okay. So in the book of Isaiah, okay, Isaiah the prophet, godly man by all accounts. Okay, he stands before the Lord of glory. Okay, and what happens? He says, "I am undone. I'm a wicked man. I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips." He's just undone. He's just realized, I'm dead. I'm doomed. It's over for me. If this depends on law keeping, I'm done. Okay. And so then God has mercy on him. God doesn't give him what he deserves, even though he's way better than most everybody else. And yet, even so, God has mercy on these people. So, now, again, obviously, we're in a situation that we didn't choose, okay? Very small group, if you remember, Federal Reserve created this system. Most of us had no idea this was going on. We didn't understand. We don't understand economics to anywhere near these degrees. So at the beginning, I would say God is going to hold leaders to a much greater account than individuals, right? So that's the first thing. They will give an account for what they did with the system in the same way that leaders in other capacities, pastors, whatever, will give greater account than their flock. At the same time, this is not an ideal situation, okay? It's very harmful in a whole host of ways. But there's a real sense in which, for very many people, we're looking at the situation, we're like, well, what do we do? If we don't take out any loans, then how are we going to get houses? How are we going to do all these things? And there is truth to that. And so my focus is not to basically, I don't want people just to walk around feeling super guilty. And Jimmy's focus is like not to that everyone walks around feeling super guilty, beat down by guilt to the point where they just feel guilty about living every bit of life that they are. But you want to identify this is a problem. Let God be true and every man a liar. Okay, so first of all, we want to agree with God about the way that the world ought to, or the way that the world works and the way that it functions and what the consequences are. So that's the first thing. Now, this is where Jimmy is a Bitcoiner. So Jimmy sees this, he sees what's going on, he sees Bitcoin come along, and he says, this is great news, because Bitcoin is money that, it's not created through debt. It doesn't do this. And it actually doesn't require you to keep taking out debt in order to just live life. And this is because Bitcoin has this amazing thing, just like gold and silver did, where it generally gets more valuable over time. Where you, in past places, the gold itself would get more and more value over time. And everything that were, created things, they would get less value over time, which makes sense, right? If I buy a pair of shoes and I use them for a year, I'm not going to be able to sell them for the same price as I initially paid for them. And so homes, ideally, would work the same way. Okay, your house, 5 years after you own it, is in worse condition than it was when you first bought it. It ought to be worth less. But the problem is, and this is where we can get on another thing here, but the problem is that because money doesn't work the way that money ought to work, and it has worked through much of history, you've had other things take on what's called like a monetary premium. So real estate has done this. Stocks have done this. There's a whole host of things. And so the way to think about this is imagine a situation in which you have a family where the father abandons the family. Okay. There's 3 kids, let's say 3 kids, mom, dad. The father abandons the family. Okay. What happens? Okay. There's going to be a vacuum left by his absence. So one of 2 things has to happen. Either that vacuum is going to be there, remain there, and it's going to affect the wife. It's going to affect all 3 kids. It's going to affect, their lives beyond that, all these kind of things. Or somebody's going to fill that vacuum. Now, even if that happens, it's still going to be less than ideal because it's going to be filled by, it's either going to be filled by the wife could get remarried, okay? But now you have a man who is parenting 3 kids who aren't his kids. And so there's all kinds of statistics that show that, that actually leads to a much higher occurrence of abuse and stuff. Now, here, let's do a little better situation. So maybe an uncle or a grandfather, okay, fills in there, okay? There still are consequences. So you have this thing, there are consequences. There's a vacuum left, and that vacuum has consequences. Now, if you apply this to money and things like real estate, because this vacuum has been left by there not being a money that does what money's supposed to do, then other things have to take on this monetary premium. They fill that gap, that demand for something to be a store of value. And one of the things that does is it provides more demand for the real estate. Because now the real estate isn't just a house. It's a house, and I'm depending on selling this house for more than I bought it for to be able to retire or to be able to make more money. It's this whole... it's this devastating cycle that, where the way out of it is to basically have money that operates the way that money is. And so then, and that's what we see happening right now, is that Bitcoin is sucking back this monetary premium away from all kinds of things. And over a long enough time horizon, we think that's going to continue to do this. And again, the consequences of that are going to be great because real estate, the value of it's going to come down, and then it's going to be more available, and more reasonably priced, true to what it actually is and the value that it provides to people.
Sure. I think maybe the most charitable interpretation of this quote is we're not necessarily binding people's consciences.
Yeah.
We're understanding that most people are blissfully ignorant.
Yes.
That most people when they're buying a house and they're just getting a mortgage, this is the world we live in. That's what you do. They don't even realize, they know not what they do.
Yes.
So for the small percentage of people that do know what they do, then it becomes a question of, what's really in your heart here? Yep. Are you trying to pull something out of the future into the now and try to live, beyond your means, or, try to not live by natural law in a sense?
Yeah.
Are you viewing your fellow peons as just other people in the rat race that you're going to just do anything possible to get ahead of, even if it's at their expense?
Correct.
Whenever you should really be mad at the governors of the Federal Reserve,
Yes.
Whatever it is, right? So obviously it's the thought and the intentions of our hearts that really matter here. Having said that, I do think the point is valid. If we can, we should try to not live on debt. We should try to the extent we can. But a lot of us find ourselves in situations where we've made decisions before we found this stuff out.
100%.
We're 15 years into a 30-year mortgage.
100%.
And so it's like, okay, and maybe for you, the Lord puts it on your heart to sell your house, and that's what you need to do, and you have to become a renter. But obviously, every situation's unique.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. And again, this is a big part of it. So imagine you're a couple, you're married, and you get divorced, and then you marry somebody else, and then you become a Christian.
Yeah.
And you realize, oh shoot, I shouldn't have done these things.
Yeah.
And it's like, what does God want you to do? Just die, go to hell, because like that. No, that's not what he wants. Yeah. He so that is very much the spirit of this. Is like, hey, this is the way. This is what's going on. There are tons of consequences that are affecting you, that will affect not only you today, but your kids, your grandkids, all these kind of things. And then again, the bigger thing of this is also affecting the spread of the gospel, the advance of the gospel. Because again, the same thing is true. I'll give you one example. When we were in Uruguay, there was a church, great church that was planted in the 50s. Okay, started in the 50s. Between the 50s to when we were there, about 65 years. That church wasn't ever able to buy a building. Now, why? Because their currency, the Uruguayan currency, failed 3 times. So imagine you're a church, okay? You got pastors listening to this. Imagine you've got a church and you're trying to, your people are your church is growing. Your people are giving sacrificially. They're denying themselves. They could be going and buying Lambos and who knows what. And they deny themselves and they go and they're giving to the church. They're giving generously. You guys are distributing to the people and then you've got a building fund and you're saving up to buy a building. And after 10 years of saving, you see the light at the end of the tunnel. Your currency is devalued to nothing. And then all of that work and all of that self-denial that went into that becomes like devalued to zero overnight. And so this is the consequence of this. This system stinks. Like this thing is not great. And so we ought to look for, at the same time as we're living in and being content with, to as much as we can with the system and operating as best we can as stewards in the system, we ought to, if there's something else available, be looking for a system that is more aligned with, that's more generationally focused and that's more aligned with the way that God wants the world to work.
All right. Meditation 8.
Yep.
We'll see where we go with this one.
Oh, yeah.
Being a software developer, I'm currently the buggy whip manufacturer that's being disrupted by AI coming into my industry. I'm having my own crisis of my career. You quote Peter Thiel in the preface to The Sovereign Individual, which is sort of like the Bible to a lot of Bitcoiners, where he says, if AI is communist, crypto is libertarian. Yeah. Okay. But then you say, Bitcoin counterbalances centralized AI surveillance and control over our finance, which I think is a pretty hopeful take.
Yep.
Michael Saylor believes that Bitcoin will be the currency of choice for AI. Let's just start with, do you view AI as a threat?
I feel like I'm not smart enough to answer this question. Like, obviously,
we talked about it a little bit yesterday, but
I rely on people who are smarter than I am, who do, and I can obviously see some of the threat.
Well, do you use AI?
See, that's the problem. Yes, it's very useful. Okay. There's things that I don't. There's things that I won't use it for. But yeah, I do use it. And again, it's the same kind of question as with the taking out debt. It's like, here's this thing that's the poison pill. It's very useful, but what are the consequences of this? And it's this awful situation we find ourselves in where, again, it's very difficult. So yeah, I definitely think it's a threat. Again, but in all things, is alcohol a threat? It's like, yeah, okay. But if you still drink alcohol, why do you still do that if you think it's a threat? Well, it's a threat when it's used, when it's abused, when it's used too much. That's when it becomes a problem. Yeah. So is there some sort of benevolent limited case for AI usage? I mean, yeah, that's how I think about it, and that's how I use it. Now, is that realistic that it's going to stay within that limited capacity? Probably not, but I don't see that as some sort of, again, it's like the fact that something is abused by somebody else is not somehow a condemnation of the creator of it or other users of it anymore. That when humanity is corrupted, that's not some sort of statement about God. Like people are corrupted. It's not like, God, what's wrong with you? Why did you create people in such a way that they were able to be corrupted? Right? Like I don't feel bad about using AI, and I don't think you're trying to make me feel bad.
I don't feel bad about it either. I use it too. Probably not to the extent that a lot of people do.
Yeah.
I have used it to code. We talked about the Tower of Babel before. My take on AI is that it feels like another potential Tower of Babel where humankind is sort of setting itself up as God. In this case, it's creating its own God.
Yep.
And in a sense, that's like a very centralizing thing, with the way that AI works. If we actually did create kind of one of these super intelligences, it seems like it would sort of converge to one.
Yep.
If there were other kind of competing AIs, they would either get stomped out or merged in or something like that because it's digital. What's interesting is Bitcoin is decentralized. And so I think Bitcoin kind of, I understand like Michael Saylor says that AIs are going to prefer using Bitcoin as a currency because it's digital native and so are they.
Yep.
But it's almost like it is like a counterbalance to the centralizing nature of AI. And so maybe...
Can you explain, because I know a lot of people, like, how would AIs use Bitcoin? Like, why would they value Bitcoin?
Yeah. I mean, obviously AIs could just hack our traditional finance system and just create dollars kind of the same way that our government creates dollars on one of the 14 computers that Elon found that can create dollars. But the point is that if AI is going to express value and get other agents to do things for it, whether that's humans or Optimus robots, it is going to have to be digital and something that's connected to the internet, because the AIs don't operate in the real world. Or if they did, I don't know if you watched Battlestar Galactica, the robots that looked like humans were called skin jobs. Okay. I think we're pretty far away from having skin jobs. So I don't think there's going to be a pretty woman robot walking into a bank and getting a teller to hand her actual $100 bills. Yeah. So one way or another, it's going to be digital. So I think that it's interesting. This could be another God working behind the scenes grace kind of thing, where Bitcoin not only allows us to, as humans, to communicate with each other and express value in a more God-honoring way and more way that honors natural law, but somehow curbs some potentially disastrous AI scenario where things become so centralized that AI did actually take over. I mean, my eschatology doesn't really have a category for God allowing that to happen. It feels like he would smote us long before that happened, just like he smote the people trying to build the Tower of Babel.
Just like, make us lose, a nuclear war wipes out these giant,
or Jesus is coming back before that.
Or all the people who know about this, God just gives them all brain aneurysms, they all die at once, and then it's...
But I will say, as a Christian, I don't really understand how non-Christians can sleep at night, to be honest, with the threat of AI. Yeah. And maybe I just grew up watching too many movies like The Matrix and Terminator or something. But anyways, we digress. Yeah. We have a few more.
I do think the Tower of Babel thing is very much aligned with that, though. Yeah. Like the parallels are crazy on point. I just...
Paul Miller's concerned too. So I've got a few guys in the concerned camp.
I'll take Paul.
Okay. Meditation 9. You make the point that unlimited freedom is debilitating. And then you quote Tim Keller, who says, "Freedom is to wholly want what I was built to do." Can you explain that idea? I think the name of this is secular negative freedom, why it's debilitating, and then unpack the idea of true freedom in terms of what we were built to do.
Yeah, if you live for any length of time and just interact with the world, we're bombarded with the idea that freedom is just doing whatever you want to do, like being able to do whatever you want to do. And that's at odds with much of reality. Like that's at odds with how the world actually works. And so there's the famous David Foster Wallace thing, which all of you have heard, because probably Tim Keller quoted it, of like you get the old fish swimming in the water and the young fish are swimming too. And the old fish says, "How's the water, boys?" And they're like, "What's water?" So like there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on, that we're just not even aware of. That's we just take for granted that the world is the way that it works. But I think one of the other things that Keller says is that freedom is not the absence of restraints; it's submitting yourself to the right restraints. And so I think that this is one of these things where. Again, this I guess applies more at like a governmental level. This is more of a governmental rebuke of, you have the justification for fiat currency. One of them is that it'll allow governments to react in the worst possible situation. If there's an emergency, they can rapidly respond by creating currency units and shooting them to where they are. So if you've been paying attention, that's the same justification we're going to argue from the exception. We're going to argue from the exception to the rule. It's like this is not a good way of doing things. You're trying to prepare for every eventuality rather than having to trust neighbors or trust the Lord. Like this is a dangerous position to be in. And so that's one of the justifications for the fiat currency system. And with Bitcoin, it forces you to choose. There are 21 million Bitcoin. There will never be more than that. And so it just forces binary choices. It forces, steward living, a steward mindset, and again, ultimately a mindset where you're not the God of the system. Like there's going to be things that happen to you where you just need to rely on the grace of God and like the either direct intervention of God or God mediating his grace through Christian charity, or the kindness of your neighbors if you're not a Christian. But again, this is not some sort of incredibly novel thing. Like this is how people lived. We didn't have government healthcare until 5 minutes ago. We didn't have government, insurance, whatever, all these kind of things. We didn't have them. We just were forced to rely on private institutions, private charities, all these kind of things where people would give out of the abundance of their production to serve their fellow man, serve their neighbors and their families. And again, we could talk a whole bunch about how just that change and the monetary change affects the relationships that people have with each other, affects their relationship with their neighbors for all sorts of reasons. So again, we could probably talk a ton more about that, but I don't know if there's anything else you want to key in on.
No, let's go to 10. We talked about a little bit. The first question I had was, you claim that fiat is a Ponzi that incentivizes debt, whereas Bitcoin stands in contrast as the equity-based system that encourages savings.
Yeah. Most
people seem to intuitively feel like Bitcoin is a Ponzi.
Yeah.
So this claim can be confusing at first glance. We talked a little bit before about how, with Jimmy's quote, right? Yep. Can you just elaborate on that contrast a little bit more between, no, actually, fiat is the Ponzi and not Bitcoin?
1,000,000%.
Yeah.
Like this is the thing is the unstated assumption from every single person who thinks that Bitcoin is a Ponzi. Well, first of all, they don't know what a Ponzi scheme is.
Yeah.
Like if you go look what a Ponzi scheme is, Bitcoin is in no way a Ponzi scheme. The unstated assumption is that everyone who is in Bitcoin only is in Bitcoin because they want to get dollars. Like they're like nobody believes, like you don't really want Bitcoin. Like you just want dollars. And it's like, no. I don't want to own currency units in a system that Joe Biden or Donald Trump or anybody else can literally create 100 times more currency units than currently exist at the drop of a finger because he woke up and had bad shrimp the night before. He just decides he's going to do something like this. I don't want to denominate denominate my scarce time, life resources, all these kind of, I don't want to denominate them in a currency that is able to do that because I've seen the consequences of it. I've seen the historical consequences. I know how this story ends 100% of the time. And so there's people who just assume that that's what you want. Oh, you just want to make money. And so you're just trying to get as many, if you're into Bitcoin, the only reason is because you want to get as many people as possible in there. So they pump your bags so that you can then exit, and sell your Bitcoin for dollars or whatever else, you want to do.
Well, this is evidenced in people wanting to continually price Bitcoin in dollars, right?
Yes.
Whereas the true Bitcoin maxis will just start using it as a unit of account.
How many Bitcoin do you have, right? They think in Bitcoin terms. Yeah.
To put it more succinctly, or just to summarize what I think you just said.
Yeah.
So the Federal Reserve Chair, like Jerome Powell, he is at the helm of the Ponzi.
Yeah.
Like Ponzi's have to have a promoter.
Correct.
Bitcoin has no promoter.
Yeah.
Right. It's an asset without an issuer. So that's the first divergence.
Yep.
And then the second divergence is Bitcoin is inherently deflationary.
Yeah.
Now, we are in a period of time as the block clock continues to count up where there is a reward being paid out.
Yep.
But we're already, over 90%?
Yeah, over 90%. Yep.
Of the supply issued. And the supply issuance schedule is defined and not controlled by anybody.
Correct.
Right. So,
and anybody who wants to can participate in Bitcoin, can mine Bitcoin and participate in that distribution.
And so Bitcoin in that sense is inflationary. In another sense, it's deflationary because people like Michael Saylor are going to burn their coins. People like Satoshi have walked away from their coins. So in all likelihood, there's actually probably far less than 21 million total Bitcoin ever.
Yeah.
And it will eventually get to the point where there are no more block rewards, so no new Bitcoin being issued.
Yep.
As opposed to fiat currency, where we're told by all the Keynesian economists that we must have inflation.
Yep.
What is that to say? It means we need to issue more units to prop the system up. If we don't keep issuing more units, the system will collapse.
Yes.
And in a sense, they're correct.
Yep.
Like deflation with all the debt that's in the system will cause it to collapse.
Yes. Yep.
And so by their own admission, that's exactly what a Ponzi scheme is. You have to issue more units in the next round to prop up the previous round.
Correct. Fiat is the Ponzi. Like again, by definition, look at what it is, and then look how the Federal Reserve works. Like in how fiat monetary creation works. It is the Ponzi scheme. Like it is 100% the textbook Ponzi.
Right. But to be clear, so their argument would be, well, that's why Bitcoin can't work because deflation is bad.
Yeah.
But of course, the answer is it's only bad in the context of a debt-based system, not an equity-based system.
Yes,
right.
Well, and again,
everybody wants to have more purchasing power tomorrow when they wake up. Like deflation in that sense is good.
Yeah. Well, here's the other thing. Like, it's real easy to say debt-based currencies or deflationary currencies are bad, but it's a little rich when the people saying those are living in countries that their entire history is built upon deflationary currencies.
Right.
Like that's the reality of human history, is that it was built on deflationary currencies. Like gold, silver, whatever they are, scarce things. This is how,
or at least the least inflationary.
Yes.
Right? Because obviously the gold issuance.
Correct. Yes. Over time, but again, the golden ages are called golden ages for a reason. Like the golden age of Rome, the golden age of Great Britain, all these kind of stuff. We had a gilded age. Yeah, the gilded age in the United States, absolutely. So again, this you can't just like the fact that somebody says something is true, and some guy in a really nice suit in the front of a big building says something, it doesn't make it true. And this is this.
Well,
again,
there's kernels of truth to it, right?
Yes, of course, yes.
Like if they let the deflation happen, there will be a lot of short-term, really painful things.
Correct. That was going to happen regardless. Like that was going to happen.
But it's the time frame.
Yes.
It's happening now, and it's really painful versus when I'm not in office anymore. So it's the next guy's problem.
100%. Yes. Well, here's the other thing. Like the stated justification. Again, this is where so Josiah, right? Josiah finds the law. He starts reading it, and he's like, "Wait a second, what have we been doing? Like we've been missing all this stuff, and we've not taking into account our history. We've forgotten it, all this kind of stuff." When you look back, the founding of the Federal Reserve, why was the Federal Reserve created? Okay, part of the stated goal was we want to get rid of these boom and bust cycles. They blamed these natural periodic boom and bust cycles on gold. They're like, if we just it's gold's fault. If we just get rid of it, then we'll just go into this utopic, this utopic state, and it'll be great. Well, if we test that thesis, the boom bust cycles have gotten more frequent and worse under this system, the Federal Reserve System, the fiat monetary system. And so again,
our economy is literally the Tacoma Narrows Bridge.
Yeah.
There's a resonance going on, and every single boom and bust gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
100%.
Yeah.
And so, but again, a lot of people are only looking at the last 5 years, or looking at the last 20 years or 30 years or whatever.
Or even their lifetime.
Yes, correct. And it's like, that's not how we make any decisions. Like, that's not how you have to have a longer time preference than that. And in the Christian case, we're like, hey, we have thousands of years of human history to look at, like the consequences of pursuing this type of action, even if it's not this specific action.
Yeah. Okay. So same meditation. We're still in meditation 10. You point out that personal transformation requires divine intervention. Most people intuitively gravitate to works-based righteousness. So can you elaborate on the true message of Christianity and how this is unique in the world of religions for our Christian curious Bitcoin listeners?
Yeah. And I think we already did this to a certain degree, kind of contrasting like the way that the law works with grace. But again, like there's
or even karma versus biblical justice.
Exactly. I feel like we've kind of gone into it, but it's one of these things where you get to a point where the system, the broken action, the action that was taken, the wrong action that was doomed to fail, it produces fruit. The seed that was sown produces the fruit, and then it gets revealed to be as awful as a certain small group of people were saying that it was going to be back here. They said, this is doomed to fail. It's going to produce this. Everybody's like, no, it's not. No, it's not. Look, we can't see any of those things. And then over time, fully born brings forth death. You see that. And so, now again, we could the whole world could collapse and all this kind of stuff. But guess what? God's got things to do. Okay. And God is more committed to his glory and the good of people than any wicked ruler is committed to anything. And so I just think it's incredible. Like it totally fits with with the way that God reveals himself, that right as this entire system on a global scale, every nation is getting ready to crumble, you end up with like, boom, this little thing pops up. That again, there's other things. Like I'm not an adversary to gold. I think gold has a role, and gold is great. It abides to a lot of these same things that we're talking about. It does have weaknesses that that have tended to result in centralization that kind of restart this whole process again. But again, you have the situation where, boom, like I would attribute to God, drops this idea, It's built on hundreds of people's work over the course of decades. He drops this idea and boom, we start to see it expand in real time. Now, why are people pursuing it? Is this some sort of dictator saying you have to use this new Bitcoin currency? No. Okay, I will never forgive. I have to forgive him because I'm a Christian, but I didn't want to forgive. I don't naturally want to forgive Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, because he ruined what would be otherwise a perfectly good illustration. Before El Salvador made Bitcoin legal tender, well, the thing that I always said to people was every single Bitcoin transaction that's ever taken place, every single person to use Bitcoin has done so voluntarily. Okay. They've done so voluntarily. They've chosen to do this through their own. They reasoned out this would be a good decision, and they did so. They took part in this, and so it's this free choice. We chose this thing. We see the value of it because of the characteristics. We choose it, and we reap the benefits of it. That was the case. Then El Salvador made the Bitcoin legal tender, and then they forced people to take it. But now they took away the legal tender. So the illustration's back on, baby.
So you were forced to accept it, but you weren't necessarily forced to spend it.
It's correct. Yeah, so you weren't, but you're forced to deal with it.
Yeah, okay.
Correct.
I think people are, and I'm talking about non-Christians, there is an intuition there that works-based religions, there's something about that makes sense. It's innate in us.
Yeah.
There needs to be proof of work.
Yeah.
So at a surface level, Christianity seems contradictory because grace is free, right?
Yeah.
But it's only because of Jesus' proof of work on the cross.
Correct.
Like the work happened.
Correct.
It's just a question of who did it.
Yeah. So the way that you could kind of tie grace into Bitcoin in a real way is you have this person or this entity, Satoshi Nakamoto. Okay, they come up with this capstone achievement that takes into account all these different, again, decades worth of work in all kinds of different disciplines. He has this idea, and he could have called lawyers. He could have said, I'm going to privatize this thing. He could have just said, this is a great idea, whatever. And instead, he just announces it on the internet, gives away his best idea for free. And so again, he takes the most valuable thing that he'll ever come up with, and he just gives it away. And so again, without being dramatic, like this, that's the story of the gospel. God takes the thing that's the most valuable to him and gives it away to the world, including to people, many of whom he knows are going to tear his son to pieces, kill him, do all these things. And yet he was still, willing to do this and, take part in this. So again, it's not a perfect illustration. I'm not trying to compare the relative importance of these things, but
okay, let's go to meditation 11. This is John Piper's reflection that God is rare, permanent, and accessible. Mm-hmm. So what do those qualities mean in the context of God, and why is this important relative to God the Son, Jesus?
Yeah. So, rare, okay, who is like you, O Lord? Okay. It's like, so somebody one time made this comparison of all right, how much would it cost to get 20 minutes with Elon Musk, right? To get access to the most powerful man on earth, richest man on earth, all these things, what would that be worth? $100 million, 20 million. It depends on how long. It would be invaluable to have access to this person's mind, his resources, all these kind of things. Well, what would it be worth to get access to God's mind? To get access to, to the person who, the being, the person who created us, in whose image we're created, who knows us better than anybody. God is scarce. He's rare in this sense, and that's part of the value. How much would you pay if you had to pay to try to get access to him? God is permanent. God's eternal. Okay, there's part of the problem with things that aren't eternal is that they break down. They break down, and again, they lose value because of their weakness, the structural weakness or whatever kind of weakness that it is. God's eternal. He doesn't tire. He's not a man. He's not. He doesn't have all these weaknesses that people have. So that's incredibly valuable as well. And then accessible, right? So we've all got cell phones. And we pull out our cell phone and we can use them to call people on the other side of the world. It's insane. People would, this looks like wizardry to people of 200 years ago. And yet the cell phones run out of battery, right? And then you're not able to contact the people anywhere because the thing loses battery. We have, again, in one sense, we have access through prayer. Okay, we have access. We can call out. There all throughout time have been awfully pagan people who, in a moment of need, cry out to God, and God saves them. rescues them. They get direct access to him. He can hear them. He's everywhere. He can hear everything. And so again, we could go on. The other thing, like in terms of accessibility, there's that accessibility that's true. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. Okay, so we have everyone has some access to God. But as good God-fearing Calvinists, I mean, like we have, like in Christ, we have direct access to God. We have direct access, to a person who's mediating for us, who sees our sin and then pleads his own blood on our behalf. I mean, we have direct access to come into the presence of the God of the universe, the God who made us and who loves us and knows us, and we can go in with confidence and boldness.
I think we just kind of take that for granted because we're moderns and everybody's got Jesus.
Yeah.
The Israelites didn't have this.
Yeah.
They had to go to the temple and
fear and only one person.
The priest priest would mediate for them and only on one day of the year.
Yes. And then because of that, like we are a royal priesthood. Like we are a priestly nation who is reigning with God. Will reign with God one day. We're doing it right now, and then it's going to happen in its fullest measure in the future. So I think it's a good. I didn't write this chapter, but this is Dan. Yeah. So, but he did a great job.
Okay, we're coming back to the scarcity thing from before, meditation 12. So this is taken a little bit out of context, but you say scarcity is what creates value. Later, elaborating that the energy required to mine Bitcoin is what gives it value. So on the surface. Just playing devil's advocate here.
Do it. Go for it.
This sounds like you're agreeing with the socialist theory of value, which states that the value of a commodity is determined by the amount of labor required to produce it. Austrian School of Economics contends that all value is subjective and determined at the margins. So can you clarify your ideas on where the value of Bitcoin comes from?
I didn't mention I'm a socialist. Yeah. No.
Are you a socialist?
So yeah, this is one of these things where like two things. So a lot of okay, so we could look at, here's an example. All right, in the book of Proverbs, okay, I mentioned this to you the other day. In the book of Proverbs, okay, if somebody asks you, you're sitting there, you have a problem with somebody and you're saying, how do I answer a fool? Okay, and you open up Proverbs, I believe it's 26 verse 4, and you're like, okay, it says, answer a fool according to his folly. And you're like, well, thanks, Lord. Like sometimes you have to kind of interpret and try to figure out, that's pretty just cut and dry. Great. And then you go to close the Bible, and just as you got the Bible almost closed, you see, wait a second, verse 5. Don't answer a fool according to his folly, lest this happen. I can't remember what it is. So what you have then is God is saying that wisdom, the very thing that can connotate or denote wisdom in one situation, can be the exact opposite of the thing that you can do in another situation. And so the reason that applies here is because obviously labor is valuable. Human labor is valuable. And so this is part of the reason. I can't prove this, and don't hold me to this, but you have the apostles who lived in a harder money system. Jesus says to them, it's very difficult for the rich to inherit the kingdom. Okay. So in a situation where you have harder currency, basically the only way to accumulate wealth is to provide greater value to people. Like, unless you're going to steal it from them, obviously, that's one way. But it's to provide more value. If you provide more value to people, then you're able to, they'll pay you for whatever service you're providing. So again, I can't prove this, but I've wondered if that's part of the reason why the disciples were so stunned when Jesus said it's difficult for the rich, because they're probably thinking, well, they can love their neighbors more. Like that's the whole, that's the law, the prophets. You love the Lord and love your neighbor as yourself. So I think there is a sense in which there is value, because again, what's the great commandment? The great commandment is love God and love your neighbor. So there's value in doing that. And that full stop is true. At the same time, it's also true that value of earthly things is relative given a different situation. Okay. So in the United States, I can go to the grocery store and I can buy a bottle of water for, because of inflation, about $1.50, $2. If I'm on a desert island, okay, I would give everything I'd give a year of slavery to get ready access to water. So from a pure physical economic level, the value of water, something as basic as water, and other things is relative. Okay. And even with Bitcoin, okay, what is the value of a Bitcoin? If this is true, which I don't think it is, I think Bitcoin is actually like $76,000 right now.
That's just the number of blocks.
Okay. So
I wish that was the price.
yeah. So the Bitcoin price right now is $76,000, but Bitcoin's price is changing in dollar denominated terms all the time. And that just makes us uncomfortable. Like we're used to there being a fixed value on things. We don't like. And so the whole conversation around value is very uncomfortable. Like it makes us, we just don't like it. It doesn't seem like there's good, clear answers. Now, again, the problem is there's multiple ways to measure value. Okay, if people are more than just economic actors denominated in fiat currencies or whatever other kind of currencies. So now again, what's another type of value? Well, glory to God is a valuable denominator. Like this is a good denominator that God considers and takes very highly. Jesus says to the Pharisees, how can you believe when you don't look for the glory that comes from God, you look for the glory that comes from man. And so glory is this unit of measure by which you can denominate value. And so again, if you are an ends justify the means kind of person, where all that matters is ultimate economic ends denominated in a currency, well, then that's going to lead you to take certain action. Now, if you let's say you denominate this is a whole other conversation, but imagine you denominate, if you're a parent, you denominate value within the health of your children. Okay. So what would if somebody came to you and said, hey, I'll give you $1 billion for you to, give me one of your kids. Okay.
Of course not.
No, there's no way. Okay. And now again, why? Because there's some things. So there's different types of economies, right? There's things that are within under the sun that are within the realm of physical goods, but then there's a whole other economy. There's a whole other spiritual economy where these are image bearers of God. Okay, these aren't coins that bear the image of an earthly sovereign. These are image bearers of God, and so we value those differently, and we shouldn't allow these two circles to mix. And so this is where you do see that happening. You get into all kinds of trouble, and all kinds of negative things happen.
I would agree.
Obviously, there's a ton more.
Just focusing in on the economic side of things,
yes.
though, I agree. There's not really a case of something that doesn't have scarcity, that has value. Obviously, we value the next breath of air that we take. So air has value, but it doesn't really have any economic value. Like I'm not going to pay for my breath of air, right? Unless I didn't have any air. But that's not true.
Yeah, or you pay for, like if you're skiing high up in a mountain, like you'll pay for the oxygen or whatever.
Sure. Sure. But in most cases, we're not paying for our next breath of air.
Correct.
Right. And so I think even the fiat wizards that control our system understand this. This is why you even have this idea that we're going to fight inflation. Yeah. Because they understand that if there's infinite inflation, then guess what? The value of the dollar goes to zero.
Correct. Yes.
Right. So for something to have value, it has to be scarce. And we're just talking about economic value.
Yep.
So I think we can agree there. It's not the scarcity itself that necessarily creates it, but the scarcity.
It's an important component.
Defines sort of how valuable it could be, at least relative to other things in an economic sense.
Yes, it's an important component. But then again, even still, when transactions happen based on a coincidence of wants or a coincidence of needs or a coincidence, like you sell things when there's something you need or want more. And that can include the most valuable things on earth. There's people who are, the most valuable Corvette. There's still people who are willing, there's still a market for it. There's a price. Everything has a price. And again, when in different types of situations, you might be forced to sell things for a price that you wouldn't do under normal circumstances. So like, again, all this kind of stuff, it gets... Yeah, it's a little more tricky and complicated than people want to make it out to be.
Okay. Let's go to meditation 13. So being made in God's image can be understood as a store of value.
Yeah.
And then that's compared to humans that are transactions lost in a vast mempool, where our efforts or transaction fees are inadequate to reach our intended destination. So can you explain that analogy a little bit?
So there's this way that the Bitcoin network works, where if you're going to send a transaction, you have to include a transaction fee. So if I want to send $100, I might have to pay another, depending on when I'm sending it, like another 50 cents or $1 to send the transaction. So I do that. Now, again, because there are different times, there's different levels of activity with other people trying to send transactions as well. The people who pay the highest amount are going to be more likely to have their transactions included by the Bitcoin miners in the next block. So sometimes what happens is if you don't include a high enough fee, if you can try to use the bare minimum amount of a fee and you send that transaction, sometimes it won't get included for days or weeks or months. And so this happened to me within the first year and a half that I was into Bitcoin. I sent this transaction fees were really low. I was anticipating it going through within a day or two. And right around that time when I sent it, the transactions picked up. And so my transaction didn't get included. So I check my wallet a week later and I don't see the balance there. I don't see the Bitcoin that I sent. And I think to myself, oh no, I broke Bitcoin. And so I have the insane privilege to have access to some of the most knowledgeable people in the entire Bitcoin space. So I reached out to my buddy Jimmy and I said, Jimmy, what did I do wrong? And he goes, oh, you just didn't include enough of a fee. You just need to include a little bit more. He's like, you just need to do a child pays for parent transaction. And I was like, sounds great. What does that mean? And so he goes, yeah. So basically what you do is you send another transaction with a higher fee, same transaction. And when you do it, basically it won't send two transactions. It'll just send one. It'll knock that stuck transaction through and it'll get to its intended destination. Now, me at that time, I'm living in Uruguay. I'm pastoring this church. And I start thinking about this as I'm like writing and doing sermon prep. And it just hits me. That is just like the logic of the gospel. Like God creates Adam. He sends him out into the world with a purpose. Okay. He has a clear destination for what he wants Adam to do, a clear expectation. And Adam falls short of that goal. He doesn't arrive. He falls short of the glory of God. Okay. He doesn't have enough of a righteousness fee or something to get where he wants to go. So how does God resolve this? God sends the last Adam into the world, and where the first Adam falls short, the last Adam succeeds. He loves and trusts his father to the end. He obeys him, and he completes the transaction. And then by virtue of him fulfilling his transaction, okay, a whole people for God comes with him. Okay, we are brought with him. And so, again, this idea, the scriptures talk about this idea in Genesis 1, let us make mankind in our image, in the image of God. Let us create him. So we humans, we bear the image of God. And then, we find this all throughout. Now, even as babies, we bear the image of God. And then you see this all throughout. God has, there's a clear way in which people represent God in the world. I remember there was a pastor who was talking about, this pastor focused a lot on like archaeological stuff when he was going through the book of Exodus, I think. And so he talked about how when you would enter into the land of Egypt, they had at the farthest reaches, they had like a statue of Pharaoh. Okay, or like an image, I can't remember if it was like just his face or something, but it was basically a way to show, by virtue of seeing the image of Pharaoh, you know that you're in a land that's governed by Pharaoh. So this is kind of like the logic of this. And so there's a very similar logic with humankind in the world as a whole. Like God creates people and he wants them to be fruitful and multiply to every corner of the earth so that the whole earth it's clear who is the God of this world. So we see that, this same principle of people bearing the image of God. But then again, as I'm going down the little Bitcoin rabbit hole and I'm doing sermon prep, I get to the passage where Jesus is talking, and the Pharisees come to him. They say, "Hey, is it just or righteous? Is it legal to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Okay, so again, they think that this is a gotcha. They don't act. This is not a true question. They're trying to basically catch Jesus in a trap. Now, what's the trap? The trap is that I think it's a few years or a few decades before this, there was a man who claimed to be the Messiah. I can't remember if this was the case or not. There was a man who basically raised up a bunch of followers to revolt against Rome because Rome required them to pay this certain tax. Now, the particular problem was not necessarily the tax itself. It was the coin that was required to be used to pay the tax because it made a blasphemous statement about Caesar. So the Jews were up in arms. This guy was like, if we pay with this is blasphemy against God. We're not going to do this. And so they rose up. The Romans defeated them, crushed them, and ended that. So the Pharisees come to Jesus and they say, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And they're thinking, again, brilliant but diabolical, he's either going to give one of two answers. He's either going to say, yes, it's legal to pay, and he's going to lose the people. Okay, this is a big problem that the Pharisees had. The people love him. We can't just go take him by force. We can't just go kill him because the people love him. Then they're going to turn and kill us. The alternative is if Jesus says, no, it's not legal. Now Jesus is going to find himself in the same situation as this previous, rebel, and then they're going to go report him to Caesar, and then he'll be killed. So Jesus doesn't answer. Okay, in true Jesus fashion, he rejects their framing, and he says, bring me a coin. Okay, and he takes the coin, he holds it up, and he says, whose likeness and inscription is this? So I'm sitting there again. I've gone down the Bitcoin rabbit hole, and I'm thinking about this. And I'm like, that's actually a similar thing. Like, let us create man in our own image. So we're going to put our image on man, and then Jesus says, whose likeness and inscription is this? And then Jesus says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. So Jesus connects the logic of people bearing the image of God, and then coins, money, human money, bearing the image of the sovereign who is governing the place where it's at. So I'm sitting there thinking, well, that's really interesting. That's really, that's interesting. And so then I'm looking at this, and I was like, I wonder what was on the coin. I wonder what was on the coin. So I pull up a picture of the coin. I find out which one it is, and I pull it up. And on the one side of the coin, it says, it's like, Tiberius, son of the divine, is this what it is? Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus. So it's the divine son of God, okay? Or the son of the divine God on one side. On the back side, it shows a picture of who they think was Tiberius's mother. She's sitting on like a seat of judgment, I think, and it says Pontiff Maximus, okay? So you have a coin bearing the image of the son of the leader who they thought was divine, who is the king. And then on the other side, you have high priest, is what Pontiff Maximus means. So I'm like, well, that's really interesting. So we have in Genesis 1, we have this thing of like, bear the image of God. We have that component, which is also present in this logic of what Jesus is saying. But what about the king and the priest thing? Like, that's really interesting. And so then it hits me. I'm like, I hear king and priest. I'm like, well, Jesus said that we're going to be a royal priesthood. That's interesting. And then when I go back to Genesis 1, there's two other descriptions of what it means to be human, of like what God wants people to do. And so the first one is exercise dominion and I can't remember what it is. It's like exercise dominion and rule over the birds of the air and all these things. So basically, it's governance. God wants people to govern over the animals. He wants there to be a difference between animals and people, a clear distinction. Mediated between. God is using people to mediate between himself and animals. So that's part of this. And I was reading this commentary about this, and the person who was writing the commentary said that these two Hebrew words that are used to describe exercising dominion, those two things are used throughout the rest of the Bible to describe the work of the kings. This is what kings of Israel do. They drive out the Canaanites. They basically come and they enslave. They do these things, and they take dominion over the land so that God will be ruling through them over these areas. So I was like, oh wow. So you do have the image bearer you have the son of God, who is the king, And I'm like, me as a preacher, this would be great if there was also a priestly component. And I'm reading the same commentary, and he goes, yeah. And actually, there's another description of what it means to be human in chapter 2, where it says that, you're supposed to, it's going to kill me. It says, hold on, we can
jump cut too.
Yeah, we can jump cut it, exactly. I always do this. I've literally told this thing like 50 times and I always forget it. It's 2:15. Guard it and keep it. Yeah. Okay. So then in chapter 2, okay, this guy who wrote this commentary, he's describing, he's like, yeah, there's another thing. So in chapter 2, he describes the work that Adam and Eve are supposed to do in the garden. Okay. The first work this kingly work is work that's done in the world. And then in chapter 2, he describes this more intimate work that mankind is supposed to do in the garden, where they have fellowship with God. And so it's to guard and keep it. Okay, and so this commentator basically said, yeah, these two words, the Hebrew words that are translated guard and keep, are used throughout the rest of the Bible to describe the work of the priests of Israel. And so I'm sitting there just like dumbfounded. I'm like, wait a second. So what it means to be human, according to these 3 descriptions in Genesis 1, is to be, basically an image bearer of God. Who bears the image of their creator? Well, children do. So you're a son, to be kingly, and then to be a priest. And that is described from cover to cover of the Bible as like, this is what the people of God are supposed to be. We're supposed to be a royal priesthood. And Israel does this poorly. They do this, in varying degrees of success. But in Christ, Jesus is the ultimate image bearer of God. He bears God's image more faithfully, more truly than anybody who's ever lived, than anybody who ever will live. He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And then he's also the great high priest. And so we see these things fulfilled in Jesus. And so there is a at least in this passage, Jesus is I don't see any way people can argue this is not what he's doing. He's clearly drawing a comparison between money, the logic of human money with people, and the logic with people themselves and God himself. And so again, there's just a whole bunch of implications of that. If you start fleshing that out and meditating on that, people are in a very real sense, people are God's money. People are part of the way that God denominates value. And so he sees his people, as we mentioned with Adam, he sees his people lost in the world. And he sees this treasure that he made lost in the world. And he sends his own son to go and rescue this treasure for his father. Okay. He does not consider his life precious to himself. He lays down his own life because there's something that's more valuable than his life, which is glory for his Father and a people for God who will be with him forever. And so all of these things, I mean, this is just this beautiful thing that you see from cover to cover over and over again. You see God describing things this way. And I believe this is part of the reason why money exists. Part of the reason why money exists is to tell this story. And there's monies that can, again, do this more faithfully and truly. And there's monies that can do this in less faithful in ways that, again, distort what God is trying to do.
Jesus, the child pays for the parent.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, meditation 14. The idea of Christian hedonism versus secular hedonism. So it provides an alternate and clear motivation or driving force compared to stoicism or objectivism. In the end, hodlers pride themselves in being low time preference, and your call to action is that Christianity is the ultimate low time preference endeavor. So can you walk us through that, and just how is that exemplified in Christianity?
Yeah. Man, this is so. I mean, John Piper played a real formative, position in my life, a role in my life. I did not write this one. This was Dan's, but yeah, it affected me just as much as he did him. And so Piper talks about Christian hedonism, like God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him. This is fantastic rhetoric. So, in the same way, so the temptation. So one of the things that Bitcoiners look at is, I could either take my ever devaluing fiat currency that can be created by governments and central banks incredibly easily, trivially easily. I can take that and I can buy a scarce amount of Bitcoin. There's only 21 million. There's actually less than that. I have the ability today to make that choice, to invest in, like, basically make that choice and steward my monetary energy there. And again, it's banking. It's banking on a certain trajectory, that a certain series of things is going to happen in the future. And so again, there's a logic to this. It's not illogical. It's basically saying, hey, I'm banking that these things are going to happen, and if those things happen, okay, then the best bet, the best horse in the economic race is going to be Bitcoin. In a very similar way, okay, Christians, okay, the Apostle Paul says that if we have hope in this life only, we are of all men to be pitied. Okay, if this is the only place that we get joy and hope is by living here, and Paul is just laying his life down, he's getting beat to smithereens, he's getting shipwrecked a zillion times, like all these things. If this is where we're supposed to find ultimate happiness and ultimate joy and store our ultimate wealth, like, this isn't going to work. Like, we're going to be in trouble. So what Paul was calling Christians to do, all throughout the New Testament, you see this all throughout the Old Testament as well. You see Paul saying things like, encourage those who are wealthy in this life not to hope in the uncertainty of riches, okay, but in God, who richly provides all things for us to enjoy. And so again, the reality, there's an eternity that we are facing, that every person is facing down, and what we have the opportunity to basically steward our lives in such a way that we can reap exponential. We can reap exponentially, not just physical wealth or a cool job or cars or whatever, but there are going to be people who are in heaven with God, or on the new earth, who are ruling with God and enjoying and singing the praises of their Savior forever, because they were generous to steward the resources that God had given them, so that the gospel could go forth, so that their families could eat, and all these kind of things. And so it's not saying, and the scriptures are clear, that it's not to say that there is unrighteous mammon, okay, because of the things that is done to attain it and all kinds of things. It's not that money is bad. It's that a love of money is bad. And so God, he desperately wants his people to know the joy and the freedom that he knows, which is by using this fleeting wealth to turn it into something that is going to be much more valuable and last far longer. And so Bitcoin, again, it's the micro, basically, or the telescope that allows you to see this this humongous thing that's millions of miles away. You get a sight of it. It looks very small at this point, but you get to see what is coming in a very real way. So again, this is not at all to compare the relative importance of these two things, but it's just like every other good parable or every other good illustration. There's a logic there that is consistent.
That's great. Okay, meditation 15. You say your allocation percentage is the measure of your faith.
Yeah.
At least with respect to Bitcoin. So
yep.
The general idea is that most people put faith in many things without even realizing it, and that in the end, faith in Christ brings a profound sense of security and hope.
Yep.
Even more than something as great as Bitcoin. Some Bitcoiners get pretty confused about this and even make outrageous claims like Bitcoin is the second coming. What kind of admonishment or encouragement would you provide to a Bitcoiner that is putting this much faith in Bitcoin over Jesus?
Yeah, that's a problem if you do that. Yeah, right. So again, your allocation percentage is the measure of your faith, right? So again, if you think about this, if somebody says, "Hey, I believe Bitcoin is going to be the global reserve currency. I believe most nations on earth, or almost every nation on earth, is going to use it," and then you ask them, "Wow," or you say to them, "Wow. I mean, that's a big statement. How much Bitcoin do you own?" And he goes, "Oh, actually, I don't own any of it." You're going to think, well, dude, you're deceiving yourself. You're lying. Like, you don't actually believe that you don't actually believe that this is actually going to happen, because your life is demonstrating something different. And so it's Jesus saying, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Like your heart follows your treasure. Wherever you key in on a treasure, you're going to go chase that. So you got the parable of the pearl of great price, right? This guy finds the pearl, and he goes and he sells everything he has so that he can buy the pearl. And so again, with Bitcoin, with Bitcoin, you have this thing where, again, Bitcoin, people look at Bitcoin, they recognize the value of Bitcoin relative to dollars. Okay, and they look at it and they're like, oh my goodness, this dollar thing, every fiat currency ever has failed. Whether it took 25 years, which is the average, or it took 100 years, or a couple hundred years, whatever, they all fail. And so it makes no sense. It makes no sense to put your hope in like bank on if you're trying to save for, retirement in 40 years or 50 years, or whatever, that you would just solely pretend like this thing couldn't possibly fail. Like that doesn't, make any sense. And so let me think here. Where we were going? So the temptation, though, is for Bitcoiners who are not Christians, the temptation is for them to take this good gift of God, to take this thing that is valuable relative to dollars, and act like it's absolutely valuable, that it's the thing of highest value. And there's 100 reasons why we could object to this as Christians, not least of which is because, again, to try to make this the reason to live or something like that, it doesn't make sense because, again, it goes back to what is money. Money is a tool. Money is a tool that is only valuable to people. Monkeys have no need for money. Squirrels have no need for money. It's only valuable to people. And money, you can't take money with you. You can't take human money with you. And so to act like and to build your life around and act like this is more important than anything else that exists here, to the point that that somebody would never, ever sell their Bitcoin. You're completely missing the bigger picture of what's going on. Like all of these things are tools. Tools are created once you've identified a problem, and their primary value is in helping you solve that problem. If it's a hammer, you can drive a nail. If you just get a hammer and you're like, this is a great hammer, and then you just hang it on the wall, it's like kind of like, what is the point of that? It doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so don't worship Bitcoin.
Yeah, don't do that, please.
Okay. All right. Meditation 16.
Yep.
You encourage seekers to show humility in the same way that Adam Back showed humility with Bitcoin. That is to say, we all must recognize that there is a God and we aren't him. So first of all, who's Adam, for those that don't know, and how does this example show us what true humility looks like, at least with respect to Christianity?
Two things. So there's a phrase in Bitcoin, famous thing, like you get Bitcoin at the price you deserve. Now, I fundamentally could not disagree more because, again, nobody deserves Bitcoin. We don't deserve anything. Like, what is the basis by which you can say, oh, look, I deserve this life or this amount of money or this wife or these kids? Like, nobody deserves anything. And so in this way, all of life is grace. All of life is a gift. So disagree with there. And then in terms of Adam Back, so he's this guy, he works his entire life to basically come up with something that ends up being Bitcoin. He works his whole life to do this. And,
some would theorize that he is Satoshi.
Yes, this is the other problem. Yeah. That's a different podcast.
Yeah. We're going under the assumption that he's not Satoshi for the purpose of this analogy.
Correct. He's not Satoshi for the purpose of this. So somebody works their entire life, and then somebody else comes along and does the thing that you've been working your entire life. You could have two choices, right? You could get furiously angry. Okay, it's a very similar. You could draw parallels between like Cain and Abel. Okay, you got the two guys. They both offer different sacrifices. One ends up being the acceptable one. One ends up being way better. How does Cain respond? He kills his brother. You could have somebody, and there's been people in the crypto space who disagree with how Bitcoin ought to work, and they do go Abel to a lesser degree. There's been no murders that I know of, but they freak out. Say horrible things, all this kind of stuff. Or, which is what Adam did, he looks at this and he goes, he did it. This guy, Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever he is, like, he did it. And then it takes him a number of years, which is, again, why some people find that suspicious. But he takes a few years, and then he jumps full bore into Bitcoin. He, mines a bunch of Bitcoin, buys a bunch of Bitcoin, and is today one of the largest Bitcoin holders, in the world. So this guy checked his pride at the door, checked his humility, didn't let the fact that it wasn't him getting the glory for it, cover, shield his eyes or make him bitter to the point that he didn't benefit from the incredible idea that, that this other person, as far as we know, had.
All right, let's move on to the 17th meditation.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of touches on something that we've been talking about, making patronage great again.
Yeah.
So you highlight 3 sobering realities from the book of Ecclesiastes. The relentless march of time, that death is all-consuming, and that the harsh element of randomness. So what's the wisdom behind these realities, and how should it help us Bitcoiners better prepare for the moon?
Yeah. So again, the reality is we're not in control. Like we're not. I mean, the reality is time comes for everyone. Like we're not gonna live forever. And again, we only have the ability to choose what we do with the time that's granted to us. And so again, you can either operate in the world during our time here as a steward, or you can try to set aside God's kingdom, God's kingly rule, and establish your own. And so again, that's just going to dictate how you live and how you use everything that you have, including the money that you have. Yeah, I mean, death is all consuming, kind of similar point. Yeah, it's like there's no, well, at least humanly speaking, death is going to end things. But with Jesus, we have hope that, again, there is hope for life after death. And so again, if you're not investing in that way, if you're not like taking into account the reality of eternity and the reality of the fact that it's not just death and the lights go off and that's it, then that's a sobering thing. So I think that's one of the things that you see Solomon in Ecclesiastes deal with. It's just like, where's the meaning? Like, what is the meaning in all these things? It just seems like everything is meaningless. Everything is, like what is really the value of all these things? And so, yeah, he just, again, at the end of the book pleads to just, fear God, keep his commandments. Like this is, everything else is vanity. Everything else is fleeting, all these things. Then the harsh element of randomness, like just, there's so many things that, you think you have everything together and then it ends up going bad. And then you think you have this and you have all these plans and they don't go according to plan. And he just realizes like, yeah, there's a time to everything. There's a time to live, a time to die, a time to sow, a time to reap, a time to all 100 things, all of these things. He's just constantly trying to help. He gives this sobering view of the world that, again, ultimately in his, I mean, he didn't know the Messiah was coming, but he didn't have the fullness of that good news. And so again, I think in the same way, like Bitcoin, people who are into Bitcoin, like just thinking about the reality of death and thinking about the reality of your own mortality and the reality of your lack of control and the reality of the vanity of so many things that you could spend this if we're correct and Bitcoin goes on to be as valuable as it is, the things that you can do with this scarce thing, so many of them, if you buy cars, they're going to break down. If you buy houses, they're going to get broken down. They're going to wear out. If you clothes, they're going to wear out. All these things, just the reality of, what are you doing? How are you stewarding this incredibly valuable resource that you have during the time that you have it? And again, the principle that we see all through the Bible, especially focused on the New Testament, is that there is a way to invest that will last beyond the grave. That will result in thousands, potentially, depending on how much money God has entrusted to you. Like there's ways that you will bring thousands, if not millions, of people with you who will look you in the face one day in glory and say, I wouldn't be here, humanly speaking, if it wasn't for you. And so again, we kind of talked about Michael Saylor and how, again, he's got one plan for what he's going to do with his Bitcoin, and he's got a ton of it. But again, it's really, I think the responsibility as Christian Bitcoiners is just kind of, amplify, and it's not to try to rain on the parade, it's try to amplify, like think about what you could do, the eternal impact that you can have with, the money that God has entrusted to you, especially if it continues to get more and more valuable over time as Bitcoin is wont to do.
I think it's easy for a lot of Bitcoiners to just get fixated on the moon.
Yeah.
And here's the obligatory LOTR reference. Yep. We don't want to end up like Schmiegel.
Correct. Yep.
Fixated on the ring.
Correct. Yep.
And what has it turned him into?
Yes.
He's lost everybody that he's loved and cared about.
Correct.
He's just this hulk of a hobbit.
Yep. Husk of a hobbit.
Yeah. Okay. In the home stretch here.
Yep.
Meditation 18. You say some suggest that Bitcoin will save society while Jesus saves the soul. Why is this view incomplete?
Yeah, it's kind of like this again, this Gnostic view of like there's spiritual things in the heavens, and then there's the wicked earthly things, these not valuable or, whatever. It's kind of got this, at least that's kind of the feeling that we were kind of talking about. And again, I just think it overlooks the fact that we live in a material, Jesus made a material world that he is actively at work in, and that he is actively working to thwart evil all throughout human history. We have it recorded authoritatively in the scriptures. We see tons of places where God, either God directly or through his son, is working to thwart evil and to bring God's plan to pass. And it can just be really easy to just to really focus on the preaching of the gospel, which is incredibly important. Obviously, it's the most important thing in the world, but to look at all these other things and just diminish their importance apart from that one goal. And again, obviously, it is of more importance. Like this is, Jesus clearly, he lays down everything in order to, including wealth, the right to have children, the right to have a spouse. He lays aside all these things because of the surpassing glory of these things. But at the same time, again, in the same way that we looked at if you look at Proverbs 26, 4 and 5, okay, there's things that seem to be contradictory. At the same time, Paul communicates to us that something as seemingly unimportant and banal as eating and drinking can be done for the glory of God. He says, and it's not just that it could be done, God expects us to do it for the glory of God. So if that means playing basketball with your kids, or if that means, again, investing in a company investing in a Bitcoin company or using your Bitcoin for something, like all of these things are spiritual. All of these things, the faithful stewardship of these things, whether they're actively in promotion of the gospel for millions of people over there, or if it's to love and serve your kids who are in your own home, God takes great delight and joy in seeing us, use his resources for that, to those ends. So like I just was at this other conference. They had these awesome hats, and the hats are like $35. Okay. And I look at this and I'm like, I don't want to spend. So I'm thinking about one for me, and I'm like, I don't want to spend $35 on a hat, but it's a really nice hat. And then I'm looking at him and I'm thinking, man, I should get my kids a hat. I have like two boys who I know, like they grab my hats and they love to wear them. They love to look like daddy. And so I'm like looking at them. I'm like, if I buy a hat for each of us, it's like $105, 100 something crazy. $105. I'm like, oh man, I don't know. And I just thought about it. I'm like, this is a small thing, but they won't forget this. And I only have limited time with them. And so I chose to do it. I bought 3 hats. We're all going to, match. They're different colors, but same design. And I just think of this, and just know when I get home, my kids are going to look at their dad, who's supposed to, be one of the first people they think about when they think about God. And they're going to know that their daddy was thinking about them, And so this is the tremendous power that God has entrusted to us. We can take something that's not going to last forever, like money, and use it in a way to create memories with people who bear God's image, who are going to last beyond us, and who are going to then use and minister out in the world in ways that, we could never comprehend, and we won't get to see this side of eternity, the fruit of. And so it's just we ought to just be overwhelmed with joy over the fact that, over the way that God has created us and the ability that he's given us to imitate him and operate in his world, and even in the things that don't seem as spiritual as directly preaching the gospel to millions of people or something.
Yeah, I feel like there's the secular humanist take on this, which is just there is no spiritual at all.
Yep.
And then this is a bit of a throwing a bone. Okay, there's a spiritual, but they're not really having anything to do with each other. As Christians, we know God created us as embodied souls.
Yes.
You can't separate those things.
Yep.
And even in the life to come, we're still going to be embodied souls.
Yeah.
We're not going to be angels floating on a cloud.
Correct.
Without a body.
Yep.
Our Savior is in heaven right now with a physical body.
Correct.
With a hole in his side still.
Yes.
Right. So I don't know. It's again, to me, this is just a rejection of how God created things.
Mm-hmm.
Or even just people just don't they haven't really thought about it.
Yeah.
You know?
Or again, they mean well. Like
Yeah.
what they want is that people will see the image bearers of God around the world and just want to devote like all of their resources and time to doing that. But I think one of the ways that I think we've missed out on this, and this is one of the reasons why I appreciate, again, there's plenty of other people who I know and love and appreciate their ministries who aren't Presbyterian, but one of the things that I just have found and benefited from with Presbyterians in particular is like a generational focus and of a thinking about, the disciples that are being made around the world aren't of more value than the disciples that I'm making in my home. And I think that that's a real temptation. It's always tempting to value the grass is always greener, the souls are always more important, on the other side. And so I think that I think that this is we all need to be challenged with this. There are some people who don't give any thought to ministry around the world and to people, other people in your city or something like that, and they need to be challenged to be more generous or to use some of the resources towards that end. But in all of these cases, it should be a greater love. It should be a greater desire, a bigger desire, not some sort of like a shrinking. You care too much. Something along those lines.
Yeah.
It should be greater. It should be a greater love that motivates us, and not some sort of small-mindedness.
Okay, meditation 19.
Yep.
You mentioned the story of Genesis 23 where Abraham buys a burial plot for Sarah from the Hittites and compare it to the Bitcoin network, calling it your Bible orange pill moment. Can you elaborate on this story a bit and talk about how in some ways Bitcoin is unique, while in other ways it's just a new expression of how humans have always transacted for thousands of years? Yeah,
so in Genesis 23, you have Abraham, he's buying a burial plot for his wife. And so the way that transactions happen, they didn't have, they didn't have paper. Like they didn't have the ability necessarily. I should take that out.
Or even the internet.
Yeah, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have these things, easy ways to, concretize and give.
Well, going back to the permanence from before we were talking about.
Yeah, they didn't have the same type of ways to track transactions as we do. So what Abraham does is, he basically says, I'm going to buy this thing. And then all these elders come around and they basically we hear, we observe, we all heard this, that this transaction has taken place and we're going to make sure that it gets done, basically. And so again, Dan, this is his story, he basically says this is for him. He had been reading about Bitcoin, and it really clicked with him that this is the type of consensus mechanism that happens in Bitcoin, where you have multiple, you have all these nodes who basically are receiving these transactions and certifying, yes, I agree. I see this transaction. It is a legitimate transaction, and we will allow it to be included in the finite space in the blockchain and conserved forever. Like as long as the Bitcoin network is running, there will be a record of this transaction. And so those two kind of things were a big pivot point for Dan in understanding Bitcoin. As somebody, again, Bible nerd, Dan, total Bible nerd.
Yeah.
Nobody, who in the world other than potentially the person who's sitting in front of you?
But I think part of the point is just that for people that are kind of uncomfortable with Bitcoin or feel like it's new, it's like, well, no,
the
something
principle,
like Bitcoin has been happening for thousands of years.
Yes. Yeah. So it's just it's a modern instantiation of this. This same principle has been happening forever since the beginning. We trust each other. This is how transactions happen. Even today, like in terms of if you buy a house, you do the transaction. You have somebody certify that the transaction took place. Then you go and you save it with a centralized authority or a group authority who basically testifies here, yes, we have proof that this happened. In this case, it's just living memory. It's living memory of these guys. And again, that was sufficient.
The gate that they were all meeting at is really just the whole world now.
Yeah.
Enabled by technology.
Yep. Yeah. So the internet bound world.
Okay. Let's move to 20. So you say that when you possess knowledge the world has yet to grasp, it is transformative. Selling your car or house to fund a Bitcoin purchase might seem irrational to outsiders, but it feels like no sacrifice to you. How does this compare with your experience with Christianity? Yeah. So, the one example, before we get to Christianity, the first example that comes to mind, right, is the famous example of buying the settlers buying Long Island from the Native Americans, right? They have this whole entire land
that, again, depending on who you ask, they didn't have real conception of like property, like owning land. So they basically, the settlers come and say, hey, we'll give you these, we want to buy this land. What do you want in exchange? And they see these, beads or something that they have, and they're like, hey, we'll take those. And so then they end up purchasing. It's a catastrophic transaction by a predatory transaction by some accounting. And so this is just an awful transaction. But to the settlers, they're like, wait a second, you just want those for that? This is a no-brainer decision to do this. And so again, if you, to people who are into Bitcoin, and if you're into Bitcoin, you could just be looking at, again, the last 16 years of Bitcoin. You could be looking at that and saying, well, this seems like, over the last 16 years, this seems like a better, given the other factors, this seems like a better, this seems like a good bet to put my, my resources into. But then the more you look at history, you're like, wait a second, there's precedent for these things. It's not just the last 16 years. This has been happening for hundreds of years, thousands of years. We can look at similar situations that they got to certain points that were points of no return. And then there was another, harder currency, another scarce currency that came along that became the thing that everybody rallied around to escape what was going on, with this one. And so, again, this information asymmetry, when you see the future or you see the value in something that other people don't see, it provides tremendous opportunity.
All right, so why does this matter?
All right, because in the same way, like as these settlers, we are settlers in a real sense. We're here for a limited amount of time. We walked in here, and God has given us the ability to turn unrighteous mammon and all these other gifts and all these other things he's given us, we can turn them into eternal souls. Okay, we can invest in eternal souls that are going to last forever. That again there's going to be potentially, depending on who you are, there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of people that, based on your life, can look you square in the face and say to you, "The only reason I'm here is because of you." It's because, and like that is just a staggering thing to think about. Again, obviously, this is under the sovereignty of God. All the Calvinist things that you can put, all the other provision, I understand. But there's a real sense in which Paul said, "I'm making my aim to save some," and there's going to be potentially some who can be saved through, again, Christians taking their resources and basically stewarding them effectively by living for, again, the glory of God and the good of their neighbors. And so that's, again, I'm not comparing the level of importance. It's all in just like these things are parallel for a reason. God uses parables and these type of things to help us understand and then act on spiritual reality with eternal consequence. So
there's only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoin. So therefore there were only 21 meditations ever. So in the 21st meditation, your call to action is to Bitcoiners to get off zero in their relationship with Christ.
Yep.
You believe Bitcoiners are a clear-cut fulcrum with which to move the world. Why do you believe that? And what's your best advice or encouragement to Bitcoiners looking to get off zero with respect to Jesus?
So assuming that Bitcoin continues to do what it's doing, okay, these people who have significant amounts of Bitcoin are going to be some of the wealthiest people on earth. And they're either going to use that power for extreme good in the glory of God and the good of people all over the world, or they're going to use it in ways that will destroy their own souls and, just vain ways that will destroy the lives of people all over the world. And so this is one of these things where it's one of these things where even more than just the pragmatic stuff, right? Because that's a really pragmatic ends look at this thing of like, these are the consequences of these things not happening from a human level. But even more than that, if you think about this from God's standpoint, okay, these Bitcoiners, okay, are people who are made in the image of God, who God created to know Him. Like the greatest joy and the purpose that they will ever experience in life is by knowing Him. And right now, the temptation is going to be for them to take this good gift that God has given them, this fulcrum that God has given them, that can basically lift mountains in all kinds of ways all over the world. And right now, they're ignoring, or they're unaware of the reason why they exist and why God gave them all those resources. And so again, it's just like any other thing that you have, as a Christian, if you're proximate to other computer programmers, right? You want them desperately to know the great programmer. You want them to know the God who made them and who designed a world that has programmed information. Every one of our cells is designed with programmed information, and trying to account for that through natural is just insane. It's crazy. And so you want them to know this God who is so creative and so intelligent and so powerful to be able to make all these things happen. And so again, in our case, we're not saying that Bitcoiners are more important by any stretch of the imagination, but we are saying that, again, these people who we care deeply about, because we value, we have something in common that we value and we see the consequence of, they're going to be incredibly influential. And so we want to harness that power. We want, for both their own sakes and for the sake of the world, we want them to leverage those things and use those for the means, in the ways that God intended them to be used. So again, if we can play some infinitesimal small, seemingly silly based on the title and all these kind of things to the outside world, if we can use this, and this can be used in some small way to that end, that'd be great. And if not, again, to the same point, This we did this for the glory of God. Like, at the end of the day, this is never going to be a New York Times bestseller. We're not going to sell millions of copies of this book, very likely. But at the same time, again, there's all kinds of ways in which, through our 5-6 years in Bitcoin, Dan and I have looked at it, and we've seen things that just remind us of God and that point to us towards who He is, and things that are of much more valuable than earthly riches. So that's how we think about it. And
I wouldn't sell yourself short. The book was great, especially as the number goes up over the years.
Yes,
I think
correct.
people
lower our time preference.
Maybe
correct.
coming back to it, right?
Yes,
as
let's go.
prescient, kind of like people go back to the sovereign individual. But
let's go.
Okay. Where can people find you? Where can people find the book?
Yeah.
Where do you want them to find the book?
Correct. Yeah. So again, we have on tgfb.com/store, you can get the book. The thing that would be the most helpful would be if you bought the book on Amazon. So we sold a bunch of copies on our website, but what we found out and forgot and then realized was that the way that you sell more books is by people leaving Amazon reviews. Because if you have a higher review or ratio of good reviews to bad reviews, then they'll elevate you in the algorithm and stuff like that. So if you want to support what we're doing, you want to read the book, you can hop on Amazon. And if you do, then by all means, feel free to leave us a review over there. In terms of me personally, you can basically sign up at tgfb.com. You can basically sign up to get updates from us. You can find me on Twitter. I refuse to call it the other name. You can find it on Twitter at my handle is at JMBush, BUSH Writes, WRITES.
Great.
So,
Thanks, Jordan.
Appreciate you, Jim. Thank you.